The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on, someone needs to mute it. The Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. The committee is meeting today to receive testimony on examining the domestic terrorism threat in the wake of the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Today, the committee is meeting to examine the threat of domestic terrorism in the wake of the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. I'd like to start by thanking the men and women of the U.S. Capitol Police, National Guard, Secret Service, Metropolitan Police Department, and all other law enforcement agencies that work to keep us safe that day and in the days since. I also want to take a moment to remember Officer Brian Sicknick, who lost his life in the line of duty, and other members of law enforcement who responded to the attack who have tragically passed away. Several other tragically lost their lives during the domestic terrorism attack on our nation, incited by the former president and his enablers seeking to overturn the results of a legitimate election. As members of this committee are keenly aware, this act of terrorism was not an isolated incident. During the 116th Congress, the committee held 11 hearings that looked at various domestic terrorism threats. Over a year ago, FBI Director Wray sat before us and warned that domestic terrorism cases were at an all-time high, with racially motivated violent extremists posing the greatest threat. Then, in July 2020, we received testimony from domestic terrorism expert J.J. McNabb that cautioned, and I quote, that the upcoming election will spark one or more violent events if the president loses his re-election bid. His supporters want him to continue, and they've talked about civil war now for years if it does not. Last September, Director Wray testified again before us, saying that racially motivated violent extremists make up the largest portion of domestic terrorist cases that his agents are investigating. Then in October, just 4 months before the attack on the Capitol, the Department of Homeland Security's threat assessment identified racially motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacist extremists, as the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. Today, we'll begin to shed light on why these warnings were not heeded. The irrefutable fact is that the threat of right-wing and more specifically, white nationalist terrorism has been growing for years. The previous administration failed to address this threat appropriately, and on January 6th, we saw the result of right here at the United States Capitol. I witnessed the event unfold firsthand from my view in the House gallery, where we had gathered to observe the counting of the electoral votes as required by the Constitution. I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will work to do a better job of confronting this threat, which has been allowed to fester and even encouraged in recent years. Already, DHS has taken action as the department issued a rare warning last week about the heightened threat from domestic terrorism. I look forward to engaging newly confirmed Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, on this critical issue. President Biden also tasked the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, DHS, and FBI with conducting a comprehensive assessment of the threat. I commend this swift action. I also urge the administration to prioritize the report on domestic terrorism required by the Domestic and International Terrorism Data Act, which is now 7 months past due. As members of the Homeland Security Committee, we too have our work cut out for us in this Congress. This committee held 11 hearings last Congress on the threat of domestic terrorism, but clearly much more remains to be done. And during a time in which both sides run rampant through our politics, I implore members that this committee to follow the threats wherever they may lead. Any denial or attempt to distract from the threat at hand won't help us address the problem that many have been and continue to sound the alarm about. The conversations will be difficult, and they should be. This threat has long plagued and preyed on the most vulnerable in our society. But we must work together to find solutions. Our democracy and American lives are at stake. Today, we have a panel of experts that will outline the domestic terror threat as it stands, identify what was missed prior to January 6th, and present what we ought to do moving forward. I look forward to their testimony and their responses to our questions so we can find a path to keep us all safe. With that, I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments and appreciate being here with all of you today, and welcome to the witnesses. I'm honored to serve with all of you and with all of our colleagues in the 117th Congress and recognize how timely and necessary today's hearing is. This year will mark the 20th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks, the very tragedy that necessitated the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and this committee. In the days and months following the deadliest terror attack on U.S. soil, Americans of all views came together to unify against the threat of foreign terrorists. Like so many challenges in our nation's history, we emerged stronger than ever. To confront the emerging threats to our homeland today, we can't play politics with national security. That's why, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your partnership as we've set out to ensure that this committee remains above the fray and focused on solving problems. Today, we sit here just shy of 20 years after 9/11 to examine the increasingly prevalent and troubling threat from violent extremists, not from some distant land, but from here at home. The threat posed by domestic violent extremists may be new to many of us, but it is not new for our country. In the 1960s and 70s, left-wing extremists known as the Weather Underground carried out dozens of bombings, including one right here inside the U.S. Capitol. In fact, in an 18-month period between 1971 and 1972, extremist groups conducted over 2,500 bombings here in the United States. 3 decades later, an anti-government extremist planned and carried out the deadliest homegrown attack in United States history, killing 168 people with a truck bomb at a federal building in Oklahoma City. The sad reality is that there will always be those who use ideology and politics as an excuse to commit violence. It is our responsibility to see to it that they are not successful. Over the past 12 months, we have seen a marked increase in the activity of domestic violent extremists. In July, amid nationwide protests, extremists in Portland set fire to police stations and attacked a federal courthouse. In December, a man in Nashville detonated a bomb planted in a recreational vehicle, killing himself, injuring 8 others, and disabling a critical telecommunications facility. And just last month, right-wing extremists attacked the United States Capitol. 5 people died on that dark day, including a Capitol police officer who was laid to rest this week. Just like 9/11, we will never forget. We will never forget the assault on the heart of our democracy on January 6th. It was a very difficult thing to watch unfold. While our nation's law enforcement and national security agencies are better prepared to combat emerging threats like domestic extremism than in previous years, much more needs to be done to bolster information sharing among federal, state, and local partners. While investigations are ongoing, I am concerned that our counterterrorism efforts continue to be hindered by bureaucratic silos and failure to share the necessary intelligence and then to act on that intelligence. The Department of Homeland Security is central to our nation's effort to protect against terrorist and extremist violence here at home, and it is imperative that we ensure it is well equipped for that mission. It is also our job here at the Committee on Homeland Security to better understand what motivates these extremists and ultimately how to stop them. Radicalization of all sorts that leads to any violence should be unacceptable across the board. With that in mind, I want to encourage all of my colleagues to rise above partisan politics and work together to examine these issues and find solutions. We must do the job our constituents sent us here to do by being honest about the challenges facing our country from violent extremism, even when it may not be politically expedient to do so. It is our solemn responsibility, especially on this committee, to be sober-minded in our efforts to secure our homeland. That is why I co-sponsored legislation championing Ranking Member Davis on the House Administration Committee to establish a national commission on the domestic terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol. Similar to the 9/11 Commission, which helped create the Homeland Security enterprise we have today, this important bipartisan commission would provide Congress with real answers to our questions and solutions to close critical Homeland Security gaps. This legislation, referred to our committee, has the support of every Republican member of the committee, and I urge my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to join us and move this bill through Congress. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Other members of the committee are reminded that under the committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd colloquy regarding remote procedures. I welcome our witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Christopher Rodriguez, the Director of Washington, D.C.'s Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. Dr. Rodriguez is responsible for emergency planning, preparedness, response, and recovery for the city, including operations at a 24-hour emergency operations center in the district's intelligence fusion center. Our second witness is Ms. Elizabeth Newman, the former Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism and Threat Prevention at the Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Newman has over 2 decades of experience developing and implementing Homeland Security and national security policies and strategies for multiple federal agencies. Our third witness is Mr. Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO and National Director of ADL. Mr. Greenblatt brings extensive experience from the private sector and government. Under Mr. Greenblatt, ADL has worked in new and innovative ways to counter and combat extremism in all forms. Our fourth and final witness is Mr. Brian Michael Jenkins, Senior Advisor to the RAND President. A former military officer, Mr. Jenkins is the author of numerous books, reports, and articles on domestic and international terrorism. Without objection, the witness's full statement will be inserted in the record. I now ask Dr. Rodriguez to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Packo, members of the committee. I am Dr. Chris Rodriguez, Director of the District of Columbia's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency, which I've led since 2017. Prior to this role, I was a counterterrorism analyst at the Central Intelligence Agency for over 10 years. And as an appointee of Mayor Muriel Bowser, I'm honored to lead an agency that is responsible for Washington, D.C.'s preparedness, coordination, management, and recovery from all hazards, from a snowstorm to a hurricane, to a global pandemic, and of course to a terrorist attack such as the one we saw on January 6th. I appear today to discuss the January 6th attack that led to the insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which based upon my experience was clearly an act of domestic terrorism. And this attack exposed in the starkest terms the threat we face from domestic terrorists and from right-wing extremism specifically. Now, various times throughout our history, we have witnessed virulent strains of political ideologies and violent political ideologies that run through the American bloodstream. But time and again, these radical movements have been rooted out or minimized in our system. Well, what should concern us now in 2021 is that the current manifestation of these movements is so insidious because while in the past they existed on the fringes of society, they are becoming rapidly part of the cultural mainstream. And these movements are fueled and fed by misinformation and lies that, if not addressed, will only continue to exacerbate our underlying social divisions and threatening to tear at the delicate fabric of our democratic culture. Now, as we manage and coordinate public safety agencies to respond to various nefarious acts, the District of Columbia is reimagining safety and security in the face of the evolving threat of domestic terrorism. I want to speak very briefly about the 5 elements of our strategy. First, we must regain the narrative. A byproduct of radical violent movements entering the mainstream is that they distort real and meaningful debate. Right-wing extremism and left-wing extremism are not mainstream viewpoints. QAnon, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, anarchists, and Antifa do not espouse mainstream perspectives, nor should they be treated and validated as such. While the District of Columbia hosts hundreds of First Amendment events per year and respects the rights of all Americans to exercise this constitutional guarantee, even when we disagree with those viewpoints, we will not tolerate violence in our city, and we will call such acts what they are in accordance with the law: crimes and terrorism. In a similar vein, we also know, and we have experienced this here in the district, that our foreign adversaries, Russia in particular, are employing decades-old tools of covert action to fan the flames of cultural conflict here in the US. And our foreign enemies do this by creating or perpetuating false narratives that strike at the heart of democracy itself, that our elections are rigged, that our system is inherently corrupt and should be overthrown, and that radical voices who call for violence or insurrection have legitimate views that should be heard. In regaining the narrative, we need to call these actions what they are: a direct assault on our system of government. Second, we must demonstrate an overt security presence in DC, at least for now. The District of Columbia, at Mayor Bowser's direction, has requested that 500 DC National Guard personnel remain on standby as a quick reaction force through March 12th. We believe that this posture is essential to ensuring that the Metropolitan Police Department can deploy resources to all parts of the city during an emergency. We also believe that we can achieve security in our city, and specifically on Capitol Hill, without making permanent the current razor wire top fencing and armed troops surrounding the Capitol. As the host of our federal government, the district government plays an important role in the Capitol's long-term security posture. Mayor Bowser has already suggested one common sense proposal, and that is to transfer control of the DC National Guard to the mayor of the District of Columbia, which would allow for swifter operational decisions during an evolving incident. As we saw on January 6th, under federal control, the Guard is not as nimble and responsive as it could be. Third, we must leverage our national intelligence network better. At its core, the value of intelligence is early warning. It gives policymakers such as yourselves decision-making advantage in a world full of strategic threats. We need to utilize a key tool developed after 9/11 in a more systematic way, and that is the state fusion centers. Funded by the US Department of Homeland Security, these intelligence hubs need to do better at sharing information across the network, because the domestic terrorist threat is fundamentally one that originates locally and then spreads across state borders. The nearly 80 fusion centers that exist across the nation have more than 2,000 intelligence analysts that are funded by federal dollars, but their intelligence should be more widely disseminated to those who need it. In DC, we seek to build out our fusion centers' analytic capabilities in both the physical and virtual realms, particularly to assist local and federal law enforcement. In the coming months, the Fusion Center will begin to deploy personnel to key federal agencies, but we need more funding and more resources from DHS for this program. Fourth, we must engage our communities and workforces better. A particularly troublesome finding in the early investigations of those who participated in the January 6th insurrection is that a small but disproportionately impactful segment of the mob used military tactics to organize and manage the successful advance into and throughout the Capitol. FBI investigations that have been made public have reported that some of these individuals had US military backgrounds and participated in military-style training camps prior to traveling here to Washington, D.C. All this said, surely there are people in our communities that might know such activities are taking place, either in plain sight in the dark corners of the internet or in casual conversations. We need to prioritize insider threat programs in the US military and law enforcement to ensure that their specific skill sets, which are developed to defend a nation, a state, a community, are not then turned on the very people they are sworn to protect. Finally, we must be prepared for a long fight. Many of the initiatives discussed here will require new law enforcement and legal tools. However, the key element of our success will be ours, yours, and mine, as well as the American people's willingness to persist in the fight. The mental and psychological toll of what happened on January 6th, as all of you and your staffs and our police officers can personally attest, can be overwhelming. And tragically, some of our finest have already taken their lives following the insurrection. Our best chance for success, though, is to be straight with the American people. But the threats we now face are arguably as dangerous as they were in the post-9/11 environment, and these threats are not going away. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I now ask Ms. Newman to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for holding today's hearing. I offer my deepest condolences to Officer Sicknick's family, all of the police officers that were injured, and to you, members of Congress and your staff. While the attack on January 6th was an assault on our democracy and therefore on all Americans, it was an extremely personal experience for each of you. I thank you for your willingness to serve the American people during this dark time, even in the face of threats of violence. I've spent my career immersed in Homeland Security-related government reforms needed to address emerging threats and government failures. The security failure of January 6th was not an intelligence failure. Many had warned about the threat of violence. It was rather a failure of poor judgment and insufficient preparation. It was also an act of domestic terrorism. As I explained in my written testimony, the statutory definition is clearly met by the crimes that occurred and the intent of the individuals that stormed the Capitol. Bipartisan agreement upon this designation is paramount to ensuring future security efforts. We must be clear with our words on this matter and stand unified against rhetoric that incites violence to achieve political goals. In my written testimony, I lay out 5 recommendations. For brevity, let me highlight 3 here. I believe we need to establish an independent bipartisan commission to explore the best ways to update our laws, policies, and culture to address domestic terrorism. I believe we need to criminalize domestic terrorism and consider updating other statutes to ensure equal justice is applied. And I believe we need to formally codify the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention to send a strong signal to the community that we are investing in prevention. Since I last appeared before one of the subcommittees of this body, I believe the environment in which we approach domestic terrorism has become exponentially more complicated. A few highlights. First, the global COVID-19 pandemic increased social isolation and other stress factors known to increase radicalization. These stressors exposed cracks and amplified grievances held by vulnerable individuals, which led to increased radicalization and some mobilization to violence. As a side note, the term vulnerable individuals is explained more thoroughly in my written testimony, and there's a graphic at the end of my testimony which you can refer to, which outlines these terms. It shows a simplistic framework for the different stages of how an individual radicalizes and mobilizes to violence. This graphic came out of a RAND study that was done for DHS in 2018. Second, the underlying causes behind the January 6th attack also increased the number of vulnerable individuals. So recruitment is easier now for extremist groups than it ever has been before. Extremist ideas have been mainstreamed and normalized through political speech, conspiracy theories, and communications that use humor and memes to mask the danger of those ideas present. Consequently, there is a high likelihood of violence in the coming months on a range of softer targets associated with their perception of the deep state, including infrastructure, mainstream media, law enforcement, big tech, and elected officials. There are many other complicating factors I can't go into at this moment, but sadly, I do believe that we will be fighting domestic terrorism that has its roots and inspiration points from January 6th for the next 10 to 20 years. And for this reason, I believe it is paramount that we establish a shared understanding of this threat and a bipartisan commitment to address it so that discussions about domestic terrorism itself can't be manipulated or misreported, further feeding the grievance cycle into radicalization and mobilization to violence. So let me return to where I started. I urge the Congress to consider establishing a domestic terrorism commission. I urge that at a minimum, we change our laws to ensure equal justice, treating threats from ideologies that originated overseas and within the United States the same. These are very complicated and thorny issues, which is why I believe we need a commission to address them appropriately. Last, I want to urge you to scale the prevention work we began together in the 116th Congress. Thank you for your support during my tenure at DHS and thereafter. Your bipartisan work on expanding prevention capabilities in the United States has prepared us for this moment, but there is still much work that needs to be done. You led a 1,200% increase in funding for prevention over the last 2 fiscal years. In federal budget terms, that's almost unheard of. I would ask you to please consider accelerating these prevention efforts. In particular, I urge you to authorize the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention and help it scale rapidly through additional resources to be able to assist our state and local partners with developing the prevention capabilities we need in our communities to better assist individuals before they mobilize to violence. In closing, we need to recognize that the root causes of this new face of terrorism are not things that the security community can fix. President Obama called it an epistemological crisis. He said, if we do not have the capacity to distinguish what is true from what is false, and by definition, the marketplace of ideas does not work, and by definition, our democracy does not work. Today's hearing is an opportunity for each of us to demonstrate democracy does still work. We can disagree without becoming disagreeable. And I believe there is much upon which we can agree. Confronting this threat will require calling on other parts of our society to defeat domestic terrorism. The challenge ahead requires rediscovering we are Americans before we are a party affiliation or a political philosophy. It requires rebuilding civic society at a local level, choosing respectful civil discourse over cancel culture, and rejecting political ideologies or identity politics that focus on grouping them to an enemy of the tribe. We'll begin here today, but each of us has a role as we leave in our homes and in our local communities, because the greatest disruption to the grievance cycle that leads to violence begins by loving our neighbor as we'd like to love ourselves. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now ask Mr. Greenblatt to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Katko, and all the members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Jonathan Greenblatt. I'm the CEO of ADL, and it's an honor to talk with you about the urgent threat posed by domestic terrorism. As many of you know, ADL is the oldest anti-hate group in the world and one of the longest-standing civil rights organizations in the United States. For more than a century, ADL has worked to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. As part of our work, we built a world-class team investigating extremist threats, an evil that has intensified and expanded with devastating consequences. Indeed, we should keep in mind, extremism is not new. It has evolved and mutated over the decades. In the 1960s, what we could describe as left-wing terrorism was a serious threat. But in recent decades, and in particular over the past 5 years, right-wing extremism, and in particular, white supremacy, has experienced a terrifying resurgence. Let me make clear, this is not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It is an American problem, and I'm heartened to see this committee coming together to tackle it. Why is the threat of right-wing extremism on the rise? I believe there are 2 forces that are fueling this movement. First, leaders at the highest levels who have repeated their rhetoric, co-opted their conspiracies, and whether intentional or not, given extremists the green light. The second is social media. No longer does a person have to decamp to a clandestine compound in the woods. Today, you can find hate 24/7 with just a few clicks on your phone. And as we know, online hate can explode into real-world violence. We saw this in 2015 at a Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, in 2018 at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 2019 at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. Indeed, white supremacists are responsible for more murders than any other type of domestic extremist, accounting for nearly 60% of all such crimes in the past decade. ADL just released yesterday our annual report on murder and extremism. We found that extremist activity skyrocketed in 2020. 16 out of 17 of the deaths were caused by right-wing extremists, and there were more than 5,000 incidents of white supremacist propaganda in the country last year, almost double the number in 2019. And frighteningly, as we saw on January the 6th, more and more ordinary people are being radicalized and spurred to acts of terror, weaponized against this very Congress and the Republic itself. For decades, ADL's Center on Extremism has been actively monitoring hate groups of all stripes. And in recent months, we've tracked domestic extremists lashing out at elected officials in the wake of last November's election. Indeed, what happened at the US Capitol was the most predictable terror attack in American history. That act of domestic terrorism was a watershed moment for the white supremacist movement in this country. For them, the sight of congressmen and women cowering under tables, Confederate flags, and Nazi symbols being paraded through the building was nothing short of a victory. And at ADL, while we were shocked by the violence, we weren't surprised. This insurrection didn't materialize out of thin air, and it will not dissipate in its aftermath unless we take action. And we believe it's time not just for a whole of government approach, but a whole of society strategy to combat white supremacy and all forms of domestic terrorism. With that in mind, ADL respectfully presents to you today the Bipartisan Protect Framework, a comprehensive 7-part plan to mitigate the threat posed by right-wing extremism and domestic terrorism while staying true to American freedoms and values. The details are in my written testimony, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but the highlights include, number 1, passing the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. Number 2, coordinating across all government agencies, federal, state, and local, with a clear prioritization of the problem. Number 3, ensuring that extremists cannot serve in the military, in law enforcement, or in elected office. Number 4, holding social media companies accountable for their complicity in facilitating extremism. Number 5, funding creative efforts to prevent people from radicalizing and off-ramping individuals caught up in these conspiracies. And number 6, targeting foreign white supremacist terror groups. Because make no mistake, this movement is a global threat. And here's what you need to keep in mind, and what I think makes our plan different than some of the others. There is no silver bullet to stopping the threat of domestic terrorism. A singular statute won't solve the problem. This is a multi-pronged approach to address a multi-pronged issue. It acknowledges the existing authorities that are already available, even as we innovate with new approaches. Members of the committee, we can accomplish our goals while protecting vulnerable communities, and together these actions should have a significant impact on preventing and countering domestic extremism and protecting the homeland. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now ask Mr. Jenkins to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, members of the committee, for inviting me to again testify. We've come through a difficult year that has witnessed anguish, anger, and turmoil in our cities, which violent anarchists and others have exploited to advance their own agendas. And we have recently seen the resurgence of threats from the far right, as the previous members of the panel have pointed out, culminating in the events of January 6th. I want to focus on that event and its potential consequences. But first, I too want to acknowledge the Capitol police officer killed during the attack, the 2 police officers who ended their lives shortly after, and many brave officers who were injured defending the Capitol. A violent mob invaded the very symbol of our republic during a constitutionally mandated procedure necessary for the peaceful transfer of power, the very essence of our democracy. This unprecedented assault on America's political system will have long-term consequences, including the likelihood of further violence throughout the country as the most determined elements of the movement transition from mass protest to clandestine campaigns. I've called for a national commission to review what happened on January 6th, conduct impartial inquiries, and level hard criticism when warranted. The commission's purpose would not be to affix blame, but the reasons for the inadequacy of security must be examined and remedied. Our concern is not just protecting the Capitol. Most of you, I suspect, have been obliged to think more about your own security in recent days. Incessant threats to politicians, their staffs, and their families vandals attacking the homes of congressional leaders, armed protesters barging into state houses, extremists plotting to kidnap a governor, now the violent invasion of the Capitol, are having a profound effect on public officials. The normalization of violence and threats affects their willingness to remain in office, and it could discourage others from entering public service. Tougher laws against incitement and communicating threats may be necessary, but how much control is possible while maintaining First Right amendments? Many, including my fellow panel members here, are arguing for a domestic terrorism statute. Frankly, I have to say I'm a bit wary about this. A new statute should improve the chances of preventing attacks by facilitating intelligence collection and criminal investigations. I believe that can be addressed by adjustments in the Attorney General's guidelines combined with congressional oversight. What many mean by a new domestic terrorism statute is a domestic version of the material support provision of the Patriot Act, which criminalizes providing material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization. Now, that requires designating domestic terrorist groups, and there's the problem. There are hundreds of extremist groups on both ends of the political spectrum, along with other issue-oriented groups that conceivably might be labeled terrorist organizations. Battle lines will be drawn as each party proposes its preferred list. The contentious debate could distract us from the problem, and it could end badly. My advice is to avoid the terrorism as much as possible and base prosecutions on existing criminal offenses, putting aside the political pretensions of the perpetrators. Mr. Katko mentioned that we are coming up to the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. For the past 20 years, homegrown jihadists have been a principal concern of authorities. Efforts to thwart their plots, fortunately, have been largely successful. I believe that shutting down domestic violent extremists may prove far more difficult. They are better organized than the homegrown jihadists, and recent actions have given them the opportunity to expand their networks. They are better armed. Some have military or police experience. Intelligence operations may operate in a less permissive environment, and programs aimed at preventing radicalization will provoke greater resistance. Let me conclude with a personal observation. Any realistic appreciation of the situation cannot ignore the current political environment. We, the people, elect you to represent our interests. Those interests are diverse and often conflicting. Addressing them requires calm discourse, thoughtful deliberation, and creative political compromise. How you conduct yourselves sets the tone. Whether it is one of divisive, bellicose rhetoric or instructive civil discourse, the choice is yours. Thank you.
I thank the witness for his testimony. I remind each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for questions. Dr. Rodriguez, just for the sake of the committee's information, were you aware of the potential violence that might have occurred on January 6th? And if so, who did you notify of this information?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a great question. And we were, the Homeland Security Emergency Management Agency worked very closely with the Metropolitan Police Department and our federal partners to assess the threat environment prior to the January 6th insurrection. We did, and as I think all federal agencies that were sharing information with the city did indicate that there was the potential for violence, and that there was intelligence to suggest that there could be violence. And so that information was shared with the city. What it prompted us to do, Mr. Chairman, as the District of Columbia government, was to recommend to Mayor Bowser that we call up the National Guard. We did that on December 31st to help with traffic management and crowd control on city property. And so we also activated our Emergency Operations Center to ensure interagency coordination from the city standpoint prior to the protests that were expected on the 6th.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greenblatt, earlier before this committee, you talked about the importance of political leaders' rhetoric in combating anti-Semitism. Do you see that kind of rhetoric as a problem for what occurred on January 6th?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman. There is no doubt that right-wing extremists have been encouraged to see their rhetoric repeated, to see their memes moved around by elected leaders at the highest levels. Again, when individuals, including the ex-president, would make statements like after the melee in Charlottesville, where a woman was murdered, or a white supremacist rampaged through the town, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," when the prior president said that, quote, "there are very fine people on both sides." Or again, when he would retweet out the rhetoric coming from white supremacists and use their language, like making claims about globalist conspiracy theories, or telling the Proud Boys in a debate that they should, quote, "stand back or stand by." Or even after the melee, after the attack on the Capitol, suggesting that his supporters were, quote, "very special people" and that he loved them. When I say that this rhetoric emboldens them, I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean it literally, because at ADL, we track the extremists. We're monitoring them on Facebook and Twitter, but also on Signal and Telegram and the other platforms that they use. And they were saying, "We feel emboldened," to one another. The Proud Boys were saying, "Reporting for duty, sir." And again, we know that tens of thousands of people who showed up at the National Mall, look, the vast majority of them were ordinary individuals who had come to believe and been brainwashed to think that somehow the election wasn't legitimate, that somehow the votes had been stolen, despite the overwhelming and unambiguous evidence to the contrary. So there is no question, Mr. Chairman, and all the members of the committee, there's nothing political in pushing back on prejudice, right? There is nothing partisan in adhering to a basic set of principles. And when leaders don't do that, it creates the space, if you will, that extremists can exploit and move from the margins into the mainstream. And I'll just make one last point. It isn't just about, again, the president of the United States. It could be the president of the local PTA. But people in positions of authority need to clearly and consistently call out disinformation, extremism, and hate, whether, again, it's coming from the President of the United States or a first-term member of Congress. Those who obsess about conspiracy theories, those who spread anti-Semitism and racism, they don't belong in the public conversation with a seat at the table. Period. End of story.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman for New York, Mr. Katko, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Greenblatt, I appreciate your comments, and I do think that the rhetoric has definitely led to what happened on January 6th, and I credit what you're saying. Is it's incumbent upon all of us to be mindful of what that rhetoric can do and what it did in this case. And that's why I voted for impeachment, because there's no question in my mind, as a Republican, I was the first to do so, and I did so because there's no question in my mind that the rhetoric inflamed it and turned the boiling water from a hot pot of water to overflowing, and that's what happened. There's just no question about it. So thank you for that. But I want to look at the issues more broadly, because that's what our job is. And Ms. Newman, you mentioned that we need a domestic terror commission, if you will. What would you envision that looking like, and what would you think we should do from a legislative standpoint to form that commission, make sure it's effective?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. Look, as a former executive branch official, the day-to-day work that you have to do, the portfolios that counterterrorism professionals and law enforcement professionals have is enormous. You're often looking at urgent threats, at trying to make sure, especially in the heightened threat environment that we're in, that we're staying ahead of the threat actors. So my concern is that in this moment, that we have really fantastic people that I trust, that I think are experts, that are coming into the Biden administration, that are going to treat this seriously. They're going to look at updating what they can from a policy perspective, or from a even a cultural perspective. I think we need to explore how various institutional cultures may have contributed to missing this, or not taking the threat seriously enough. The honest truth is, this is extremely complex. As Mr. Jenkins pointed out, we really need to weigh the pros and cons of what, if we change the law, what are the unintentional consequences? There are many communities that have been historically hurt by laws that were passed to try to address terrorism. We need to treat that seriously and hear their concerns. It is not something that in your day-to-day work as a counterterrorism official, you have the time and the space to treat with the level of diligence it deserves. And that's why I think this is where you need a commission. You also need it out of, quite frankly, the political spotlight. The rhetoric I'm seeing on certain fairly prominent commentators that are painting with a very broad brushstroke. They, whoever they is, believe that 74 million Americans that voted for President Trump are domestic terrorists. Now, I'm an avid consumer of news, and I've been a news commentator of late. I haven't heard anybody saying that. It is not a prominent talking point in the mainstream, if you will, and yet we have just informed an echo chamber, and it continues to be repeated, that they are now painted as domestic terrorists. Well, unfortunately, that feeds the grievance cycle. That is likely to create more moving towards radicalization, potentially mobilizing to violence, because they've now been told that they're painted as domestic terrorists. So we have got to cut that off. We have got to cool the rhetoric happening on both sides. And part of the way to do that is to stand up a commission, bipartisan, that the people that are selected are trusted as being experts, honest brokers, and let them go off behind closed doors and debate this. And then let them bring it out to the public, to you, the Congress, who have the most important job of debating what the laws should be in our country. So I think you're looking for expertise in counterterrorism, law enforcement, civil liberties, and representatives from communities that have historically been on the receiving end of too much scrutiny or abuse by authorities. We need expertise from all of those to come and evaluate what the best path forward is here.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. And Mr. Jenkins, real briefly, two questions, and you can answer them briefly if you can. First of all, obviously, some of the far-right violent extremists manifested itself on January 6th, but is it fair to say that, violent extremism goes across the entire political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, and that's something we need to keep in mind as we go forward here? That's number one. And number two is, if you want to add anything to what this commission should look like and what Ms. Newman said. Unmute yourself, please.
To the first question, you yourself pointed out that in the 60s and 70s, we were dealing with left-wing terrorists. In the 80s and 90s, it shifted back to the right. For the last 20 years, we've been looking at jihadist terrorists. And in recent years, right-wing terrorists has resurged again to be our principal problem. This moves over time, and I think we do have to address all dimensions of the threat coming from left and right. That's the nature of the kind of political violence we deal with in our country. In answer to the second part about the mission of a commission, I certainly agree with Ms. Newman that a bipartisan commission, insulated from daily news and partisan politics, can, number one, provide an accurate, thorough history of the events of January 6th. The 9/11 Commission's history of the 9/11 events is still the most accurate, thorough account, and that's useful. I think it can look at the intelligence issues, the security issues, not in the narrow sense, but in the broadest sense about how we protect our government and its processes going forward in an age of the internet, and without turning really our public buildings, including the Capitol, into armed fortresses.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes other members for questions they may wish to ask witnesses. I recognize members in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority. Members are reminded to unmute themselves when recognized for questioning and to then mute themselves once they've finished speaking, and to leave their cameras on so they may be visible to the chair. The chair recognizes for 5 minutes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and to the ranking member as well, and to the witnesses. The attack on the Capitol was an act of domestic terrorism, and it was primarily and much attributed to the words of the President of the United States, who emboldened President Trump, who emboldened those who carried out this terrorist acts. I want to, first of all, acknowledge the loss of our beloved officer, Officer Sicknick, and other officers who have also lost their lives, but those who now continue to suffer with injuries, some of whom are still in hospitals. I believe it's our responsibility to find a solution and to do it in a bipartisan way. We need to do it as Americans. So I'm interested, Dr. Rodriguez, you indicated information coming from another number of sources. Would you tell me whether you, as DHS, know that you got information directly from FBI National? And did you convey that information to the Capitol Hill officers, police officers brass, the chief and others in your preparation? Dr. Rodriguez?
Thank you, Representative Jackson Lee. I appreciate the question. To the first part about getting information from the federal government or from the FBI, yes, we have good information sharing and intelligence sharing relationships with the Washington field office here in the district. And we were getting information from them about the potential for violence.
Did you convey that to the police on Capitol Hill?
I was just about to get to that. So we did convene, the Metropolitan Police Department and my office convened a variety of different phone calls and briefings with all relevant federal stakeholders, the police and the Capitol Police, and all of our federal partners, to make sure that everyone had the same intelligence and the same information.
Thank you so very much. And I support Mayor Bowser's need for control over the National Guard. Thank you so very much. Let me ask Ms. Newman about the idea of what's been represented is the number of witnesses, the number of individuals found to be affiliated with the United States military and law enforcement formally, either active or retired. What would be your thoughts about the idea of stopping this tide of extremism in these particular organizations, overcoming the many excellent officers who stood the line for us, visibly fighting against domestic terrorists? How do we address that? And I'd like the witness, Mr. Jenkins, to answer that question as well. Thank you. Ms. Newman, and my time is short. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. Yes, can you hear me?
Very well.
Thank you for the question. I believe that though it might have shocked the American public, and there's been a lot of conversation about it, this has been a known challenge for decades. We know that white supremacist groups and militia groups target former law enforcement for recruitment purposes upon their retirement. We also know that they encourage people when they're young, when they've been recruited into these movements, to stay clean so that they can enter into and not get caught through screening mechanisms that are in place, so that they can get into the military, get into law enforcement. This is primarily because they're looking for people to have the training associated with being in the military and the law enforcement. So your question was, what do we do about it? I do know that military and law enforcement cultures do have.
I have a short period of time, so I'll
Yes.
take your answer, and I'll just get Mr. Jenkins for a brief moment, because I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Greenback very quickly, and have a very short time, seconds. Mr. Jenkins, do you want to offer any comment?
Yes, no, the military can and over the years has repeatedly has to address the issue of political displays of political loyalties, of things that interfere with the unity of effort that is required in the military. They have experience in doing so, and they can do so. With regard to police departments, the major police departments have the ability to do this and are addressing it. But we have 17,000 police departments in this country, and to get some of the smaller police departments in various parts of the country to do this is a much bigger challenge.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, the symbols of racism, hatred for African Americans, hatred for people of the Jewish heritage and faith, why is that so strong in the white terrorists or domestic terrorism?
So there are different types of right-wing extremists, Congresswoman, but that you could bunch them into white supremacists and sort of anti-government types. But racism and anti-Semitism is at the beating heart of these movements. They believe there's a conspiracy controlled by Jews to use Black people to take over the white race. It is wrong. It is lunatic. But that's what we're dealing with, and unfortunately, it's far too prevalent.
Thank you so very much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you so very much.
Thank you very much. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana for 5 minutes, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say I'm humbled to return to the Homeland Security Committee and continue working to ensure the safety and security of our nation. I'd also like to welcome all the new members to the committee. This is an effective and functional and well-led committee. We seek nonpartisan solutions to challenges that face our country. It's an honor to resume my duties as a ranking member of the Board of Security Facilitation and Operations Subcommittee. There's still an abundance of work to be done to secure our nation, and I look forward to working with my colleagues in this committee to make that happen. The Biden administration has unfortunately begun implementing dangerous policies that threaten our homeland. The administration's proposal of amnesty for 11 million illegal immigrants will allow individuals who have knowingly committed the crime to receive the benefits and privileges that normally come with United States citizenship. This could be at the expense of hardworking Americans who are struggling due to the COVID-19 impact. This issue is further compounded by the Biden administration's executive order to end funding for the border wall. Reports from boots on the ground and crime statistics overwhelmingly show that physical barriers work. They deter and delay illegal crossings, which gives our border agents an advantage, and they need that over the illicit activities of drug cartels, gangs, and human traffickers. Those guys are outnumbered down there, and any delay in deterrence to the actual crossing gives them a chance to respond. Further, what's referred to as the Remain in Mexico policy, MPP, has been a critical tool in securing our southwest border. MPP ended the incentive of making fraudulent asylum claims and prevented migrants from disappearing into the United States. The end of that, catch and release is back. Reversing that policy allows our laws to be exploited. These Biden administration actions encourage illegal immigration. They reward it, and they will undoubtedly result in a surge of immigrants at the border, creating a new humanitarian crisis in the middle of a pandemic. Politically driven policies to reduce the footprint of Customs and Border Protection capabilities and resources at our southern border will also increase the number of immigrants who choose to take the dangerous illegal journey across our nation's Bottom border. The administration's immigration policies are not safe for the American people or immigrants. Border security should not be as partisan of an issue as it has become. It never was before. We should all agree that we should secure our sovereign border. Together, we can work on making improvements to our immigration system while enforcing laws and providing security to our citizens. I'm pleased to continue the important duty of securing our homeland. I look forward to working with my colleagues moving forward. And I thank the witnesses for being here today. The topic of domestic terrorism should continue to be addressed aggressively through this committee. None of us condone any type of violent protest, while at the same time we support a citizen's right to have his grievances heard through his First Amendment protections to assemble and to redress those grievances. So we must seek the balance of aggressively prosecuting domestic terror where it's truly uncovered after a thorough investigation and due process has been served, and at the same time maintain our core principles of protection of First Amendment rights and freedoms across the country. Mr. Chairman, I especially appreciate your leadership. You have been a solid and fair and incredibly even-handed gentleman through the course of my service. I look forward to working with my colleague and friend, Representative Katko, as the ranking member. God bless us one and all. We have work to do, and I yield, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to congratulate you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for getting this hearing together, a very timely and important hearing, but most especially I want to congratulate you on once again taking the helm, the gavel as our chairman. Look forward to continue to work with you, and I want to congratulate also Mr. Katko on his new role as the ranking member of the full committee. I have found Mr. Katko to be one of the most bipartisan members of Congress. I've enjoyed working with you, Mr. Katko, on a number of issues, particularly around cyber, and I especially appreciate your leadership on that topic. So with that, thank you. I just wanted to welcome our witnesses. Thank you for your input and your insights today, and helping us and guiding us as we go forward to get our arms around the challenges we face around domestic terrorism and the undermining of our democracy. This is a long-term challenge that we are going to have to confront, and we have to get this right for the good of our country. One of the most corrosive things I see out there, and that we have to contend with, is the disinformation, misinformation campaigns that are out there, and that continue to have this terrible corrosive nature. Ms. Newman, I wanted to start with you asking what tools and metrics does the Department of Homeland Security have in place for measuring the prevalence of corrosive disinformation, misinformation in circulation? And also, Ms. Newman, I wanted to ask, in your written testimony, you highlight that the starting point for many extremists is a vulnerable population who may be frustrated or angry and are susceptible to messages of blame and grievance. You list countermeasures, including community-based resilience and direct counter-messaging. What agencies or organizations are in place to implement these countermeasures, and what more can we be doing? But if you can start with the misinformation, disinformation.
Thank you for the question. Yes, sir, and thank you for the question. On the disinformation, at DHS, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, largely has taken the lead around disinformation, in particular because of election security. But I believe they appreciated that there is much to disinformation that expands far beyond the elections. In particular, we noted when the pandemic was starting back in March, we saw early signs of disinformation and misinformation. My former staff actually predicted that we were likely to see violence related to that, and sadly that became true. You asked though how we measure it, and I don't know that I have a good answer. During my tenure, it was certainly more qualitative, not necessarily quantitative. But it has been a year since I was at the department, so they may have made some advances. Certainly, they were able to tell me whether there had been an increase or a decrease, or if the nature or origin of it had shifted. But I don't know that we have solid metrics. That would be a good question to ask the department. On the nature of the vulnerable individuals and what do we do, that is where the Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention is doing work around innovation and research. You all provided grant funds this last year to increase to 20 million. And those funds, in part, are going to research some of these issues. There are also some private industry or private sector efforts. The CVE, Moonshot CVE comes to mind, where they're looking at when people search for certain terms, if they are offered kind of an alternative perspective, does that messaging work? Does that move people away from maybe the disinformation that they were seeking? So there are any number of efforts, including one that I think is fairly promising, a peer-to-peer exchange where college students are, as part of a class in communications, develop campaigns to basically counter disinformation, and win the winning. Usually, it's done in a contest style. The winning campaign gets used, paid for to be used more broadly in their community. I think innovation is really important here. Disinformation, of course, has been around for decades, but the viral nature of it through technology makes the challenge very hard.
Okay, do you think that DHS is the agency that should be leading this counter messaging resilience within the U.S. government? Yes or no?
It's certainly yes, in strong partnership with other agencies that have expertise.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know my time is expired. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes gentleman from North Carolina for 5 minutes, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Newman, you're familiar with the security profile around Lafayette Square and the events of last June, where St. John Church was burned somewhat, and then there was a big controversy over the security cordon that was sort of established thereafter, right? You're familiar with that? Ms. Newman, are you
I am familiar. I was a private citizen at the time.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I can. I was a private citizen at the time, but I am familiar with the public accounts.
And do you spend time in Washington even now, I assume, right? Ms. Newman, were you able to hear me?
Yes, I live in the area.
Have you been in the Lafayette Park area since then and seen the fencing and so forth that's in that area?
Yes, I live in.
And it's also true that since last summer, there's been much of the downtown
Yes,
has
sir.
been boarded up and so forth, correct? Ma'am, there are a lot of the storefronts and so
Yes,
forth
sir.
down there that have been continuously boarded up, right? And so you've also said in your paper, made the point that, in fact, on page 10,
That's correct.
that there's a known challenge involving right-wing extremist violence, and that, in fact, you sort of make the point that there's a false equivalence drawn, and you say, and you make the point that the official view is that the source of right-wing violence is actually more concerning as a matter of domestic violent extremists. Is that correct? Are you able to hear me, ma'am? I'm not sure my
point is that historically the statistics show that the preponderance. Yes, sorry, there does seem to be a delay. I am able to hear you. The issue is that the statistics show that there has been more violence, more planned attacks, more arrests coming from groups that would be considered right-wing extremist. The CSIS, ADL, multiple organizations have studied this from a statistical standpoint. And you have seen, let's just take the last 10 years, 76% of all hate crime related murders are coming from that right-wing violent extremist ideology as compared to Islamist jihadism and left-wing violent extremism. So the issue is one, not that we don't need to treat all violence with seriousness and go after that threat. But statistically speaking, we have seen more come from what is often labeled right wing.
Given the prevalence of that, wouldn't it be true that there would have been a fairly obvious need for a significant security profile around the Capitol on January 6th? And do you have any, in fact, I understand that there were some threat warnings and so forth in advance. Do you have any insight into why decisions were made not to have the sort of security around the Capitol that we have right now?
I think Ms. Newman is having some challenges with her internet right now.
I will tell you that as I was observing on the TV, I was Can you hear me?
Mr. Chairman, I think this is so.
I'll keep talking in case you can.
I think
I
perhaps
believe
I'll just
that what I observed on TV, I thought that the security was woefully unprepared. It did not make sense to me why police officers.
The gentleman has yielded his time, Ms. Newman, and we'll go to our next witness. Questioner. Chair recognizes Mr. Correa for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank you, Chairman Thompson, for holding this most important on domestic terrorism. And Mr. Katko, I want to congratulate you for your position as a ranking member. We're going to continue to have a long discussions. As you know, this is not a Democrat or Republican issue, but rather this is an issue about the security of all Americans here and abroad. And Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you for this hearing because, as you remember, I called on the House Homeland Security Committee right after the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally where 32-year-old Heather Heyer was killed. I called on this kind of a hearing to address this homegrown right-wing terrorism. So I'm glad we're finally here. In the few moments that I have, I want to ask some of our witnesses a couple of questions. First, my question to all of you, given the events that we've just witnessed, especially January 6th, and again, having been on that gallery myself and watching everything unfold, are we now prepared? Are we adequately redirecting resources to address domestic terrorism? After 9/11, rightly so, we focused almost exclusively on foreign terrorism. My question is to all of you, are we now focused the way we should be on domestic terrorism? Mr. Rodriguez.
Thank you, Representative Correa. I do think that in the wake of January 6th, we need to reinforce the importance of information sharing and intelligence sharing, and that's why I spoke in my comments.
I'm limited my time, Mr. Rodriguez, so let me ask you. We talked about more than 17,000 police agencies, fusion centers. Do we need more legislation, more resources, or we just have to have a better attitude in terms of coordinating information?
We need more information to build out their capabilities. and get that information flowing and get liaison officers into some of these federal agencies. Yes.
Ms. Newman. Same question. Mr. Greenblatt.
What I would say, Mr. Congressman, is we've at the ADL worked closely with the FBI, who I think is focused on the problem, but we do not yet have a whole of government approach. We do not yet have adequate resources. We do not yet. The Biden administration has given us some very encouraging signals and said they will make it a priority, but now we really need an integrated federal strategy across the executive branch. And Mr. Congressman, we also need state and local governments to make sure they are also resourcing to the threat.
Mr. Jenkins.
Certainly the focus is there right now. I can't answer to how the resources are being readjusted. I think we do need, however, to have a rethink of our fundamental strategy. We simply cannot take the strategies that we have used to deal with homegrown jihadists and say we will apply these to domestic violent extremists. Because there are different conditions, we do need to have a fundamental rethink of our whole of government strategy to deal with this problem.
So, Mr. Jenkins, you talked about the material support, a legal framework as it addresses foreign terrorism, maybe flipping that and applying that to domestic terrorism. I'm thinking to myself, YouTube, GoFundMe, First Amendment, hate speech that incites hate, violence. Do we need more legislation? How can we pivot from foreign material support to domestic support and preserve our constitutional rights?
Mr. Correa, in my written testimony and in my oral testimony, I have said that I am very wary of additional legislation or additional criminal statutes. I think we do have adequate criminal statutes to deal with this as a criminal problem. I think that if we go in the direction of adding terrorism statutes to deal with the domestic issue, we are going to become embroiled in endless discussions about definition and about designation of groups. So I would be very, very cautious in that area.
Mr. Greenblatt, same question to you, sir.
Mr. Congressman, maybe a bit beyond scope for this committee, but I believe that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act absolutely needs attention. It needs to be reformed. It creates a shield of liability for the big social media platforms, a shield that I would suggest to you they have abused. They have utilized it to the detriment of the public. It absolutely needs attention. I know Congressman Malinowski and Congressman Eshoo have a bill on that. It absolutely merits your attention and that of other members of Congress.
So you do believe there is some legislative fixes that we can implement to help?
The Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act absolutely should be passed, and that's out there right now. So there's some existing, and the No Hate Act as well should be looked at to deal with hate crimes. And then I think new legislation, Mr. Congressman, to look at Section 230. It is long overdue, and you will find widespread support in civil society and in the business community if you take that on.
Same question, Ms. Newman, in a brief moment.
Gentleman's time from California.
Thank you.
Has expired. Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Good morning, everybody. It is wonderful to be with you all. I do want to congratulate the chairman on being chairman once again and look forward to working with him. Had a wonderful relationship last year. And of course, our ranking member, Congressman Katko, I know will do a wonderful and fine job, and I look forward to working with him. I'm proud to be here with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle and to be addressing these real issues that are facing our nation. As you know, I'm someone that served at almost every level of government, and I understand the importance of bipartisanship, and it would be supremely cool, I don't know how else to say it, if we actually could do it. It would be wonderful if we were like an example of one of the very, very few committees that actually achieve that goal, and I think that it is possible. You know, in all my years as a dentist in state politics, state senate, which I was in for 16 years, I never thought I'd be here discussing the threat that violent domestic extremism exposes to our great nation. Whether it's left-wing extremism, such as what we saw in Portland, Seattle, Kenosha, and even here in DC, or right-wing extremism, as what occurred at the Capitol on January 6th, it is a serious issue and it must be remedied. Just to be clear, I'm not condemning peaceful rallies in memory of George Floyd or Jacob Blake, but rather the violent anarchists who senselessly take advantage of protests. No form of extremism should ever be tolerated, period. We can't pretend one side is good and one side is bad. We need to use common sense and work with one another. We live in a country where freedom of speech is not only allowed, but it is encouraged, which needs to happen without destructive and divisive actions. And that's the real devil in the details here with all of this. Our voices as members of Congress need to be used to soothe rather than to inflame. And I just wanted to agree with Jonathan Green on Section 230. I think there's support for legislation along those lines on the Republican and the Democratic side. And I think you're absolutely right. They've gotten away with too much too arbitrarily. And thank you for making that statement. I have a couple of questions. And one of them is, and let me find it, to Chris Rodriguez. And Chris, what I wanted to ask was, how much is too much when we talk about the kind of protection? This is a very specific question around the Capitol. We didn't have enough before, obviously. And I have to be honest with you, as somebody who was used to being in the state Capitol many years and now in this Capitol for a few years, as you just walked around, sometimes you'd have the sense, wonderful, brave, good men and women, that there just wasn't enough of them and enough help for them. So we've learned the hard way that we need to do more, but are we overdoing it a bit? I mean, we're literally affecting commerce in the city, we're affecting traveling in the city, we're affecting a way of life. Somebody asked me when I went to the inauguration, how did I feel or how did it feel? And to be really honest with you, I felt like I was in a third world country, or I was somewhere, I was in Venezuela or somewhere. It just didn't feel like America. The amount of National Guard we had and the amount of barbed wire. When is too much just too much?
Thank you, Congressman. It's good to see a fellow New Jerseyan today, but I would say that, I think
we always stick together, you know that.
Yeah, we do, sir. I would say that, we do recognize from the city standpoint the importance of security. We do not agree that the current security footprint at the Capitol is something that should be maintained permanently. It is the people's house, and we need to make sure that the citizens who it serves has access to it.
Yep, and I agree with you. And I think it's one of the first things we have to work at is really finding the right formula for safety, but making sure it's still the people's house. Just the feeling you get in your gut. It's not reminiscent of America. It's not reminiscent of our Capitol and what we've been. We've had things happen before. We have to fix them. We have to make sure we're safe. We may need more and we may need to check better, and I have no problem with that. But we have to, in some way, get back to, I have all these kids piled up, and everybody does here, who want to go and tour the Capitol, and families and just people. It belongs to them, and we want to get them back. So that's so important, and I hope that we really do that soon. I had another question, if I have time for one more question. And that
gentleman's time has expired.
It did. I couldn't see the clock. Thank you so much, Chairman.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It seems like you've been inundated with New Jerseyans all of a sudden. Ms. Newman, I'd like to ask about the responsibility that political leaders bear for encouraging and inciting the violence at the Capitol. In your testimony, you note that as of last week, 78% of Trump voters believe that the presidential election was stolen. This follows months of lies by the former president and his allies that the election was stolen. These baseless claims of election fraud have been rejected by courts over 60 times in multiple jurisdictions. Can you please share with the committee how these months of lies helped contribute to the violent mob that killed a U.S. CP officer and led to 2 others to death by suicide?
There we go. Yes, sir. The issue that we have at the present moment is that there is still a perpetuation of this belief by that the election was stolen, and that the latest poll from last week was around 78% of Trump voters believe this, and that's about 57 million Americans. So when I look at that through for the potential of violence, of course, not all 57 million would go and do something violent about this. I think in some ways January 6th really crystallized for many that was too far. But when you're looking at the radicalization process, you have vulnerable individuals and a smaller subset of those radicalized in their thought and a smaller subset of those mobilized to violence. That's what that graphic that Rand produced kind of shows. And my concern is when your vulnerable pool is 57 million people, 1% or even half of 1% puts us at 250,000-ish people. And that's too much. I mean, if somebody were to say we have 250,000 ISIS adherents inside the country would panic. But the potential that we have, the longer that this lie is allowed to stay out there. So it's really important for credible voices within the community to come out very clearly and explain the election was not stolen. That there was not enough fraud to overturn the results of the election, and help us shrink that pool of vulnerable individuals. That's not going to save us all of the potential violence, but that goes a long way to helping the security officials be able to wrap their arms around the challenge that we have.
Thank you. Also, in your testimony, you note that recruitment is easier now for extremists. Extremist ideas have been mainstreamed and normalized via political speech. Is this a trend? Is this trend reversible? And if political leaders that are perceived to be sympathetic to extremists were to speak out and disavow these lies about the election, could that lead to a reduction in threats in violence?
So yes, we need more credible voices to be speaking out, calling for calm, telling the truth. That reduces our vulnerability.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, for 5 minutes.
Terrorism, I think it is
Start over.
No, I'm sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the chairman knows, when I was chairman, we had several hearings on domestic terrorism. I know it's been an issue of concern for the chairman as well. I think that what happened on January 6th, when you look at the USA Patriot Act, they actually defined domestic terrorism and international, but they never included any charges or penalties for domestic terrorism. They only did it for international. I think it was because in 2001, they were more focused on foreign terrorists like Al-Qaeda, those responsible for 9/11. But the definition says activities that involve dangerous acts to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or any state that appear to be intended to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion or affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction. I think the Capitol attack seems to fit squarely within that definition. So my question, I introduced a bill along with Congressman Weber last Congress called the Domestic Terrorism Penalties Act, which will, and working with the FBI, who fully agree, they open up DT cases, but they can't charge it as a domestic terrorism case. So my question is to both Ms. Newman and Director Rodriguez, do you believe that now is a time that we should proceed with this type of legislation?
I do. I believe that while the prosecutors and the FBI are doing the best that they can with the tools that they have, and they will tell you, hey, I can usually deal with this. You also see them having to go the extra mile in a way they really shouldn't. There was a case late summer of last year that was a Boogaloo Boys case, and the best way to be able to make sure that they were able to be prosecuted was to see that they got tied to Hamas in their planning, and that just shows you, it's indicative that, hey, if we can get them tied to a foreign terrorist ideology or group, it's easier for us to prosecute. And so there's one thing, it's just, let's make their jobs just a little bit easier. But the second thing is just equal justice. It doesn't make sense to me why if you commit a crime in the name of white supremacy, or you commit a crime in the name of an ISIS ideology, that you get more jail time for ISIS versus a violent white supremacist act. We should treat things equally. That's what equal justice under the law means.
I agree with that statement. Mr. Rodriguez?
Yes, Congressman, I do believe that it's absolutely critical that we hold individuals accountable for terrorism, domestic and international.
Well, thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I hope we can work on getting this bill out this Congress. I think if anything, what happened January 6th just cries out. And I was a federal prosecutor as well, and I know there are other charges that can be brought, but I think it sends a strong message about where Congress is, that we're going to treat domestic terrorism on an equal plane as international terrorism. My last question has to do with threat streams. I also introduced a bill to use the fusion centers to gather the social media. It's my understanding that prior to January 6th, there was quite a bit of social media coming in. I think it was underestimated. I think the crowds were underestimated and the level of violence was underestimated. I think it would have been helpful in terms of the planning of security for January 6th, specifically the National Guard. What do you think about a bill to allow the fusion centers to gather this social media in advance to help in the planning of these events? But also, what in the world happened with the National Guard that day? Why did it take maybe 2.5 to 3 hours for the National Guard to respond? Now I would ask Director Rodriguez and I guess Ms. Newman again.
Congressman, thank you for the question. If you're referring to the Protecting America Through Information Sharing Act,
Yes.
I believe that is absolutely critical for the fusion centers to be able to work with technology companies to look at the indicators of violence and of terrorism. The challenge, as you know, sir, is that some of those fusion centers are not designated as law enforcement entities, and some of them cannot access that information. So I know here in DC, we have legislation that's already been passed and signed by our mayor that designates our fusion center as a law enforcement entity to access law enforcement sensitive information. On the issue of the National Guard, I think you'd have to ask the National Guard, but that's one of the reasons why we support the mayor of the District of Columbia controlling the Guard as a governor, as the equivalent of a governor, to be able to deploy or redeploy resources as swiftly as possible.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. Any final comments?
I concur. I'll keep it short and just say I concur.
Well, Chairman, I'd love to work with you on these two pieces of legislation, and I think it's vitally important.
I think as general sentiment that we have to do something, and we have a number of members who have expressed an interest, so I'm sure somewhere there will be agreement on specific legislation. Chair recognizes the young lady from Michigan, Ms. Slacker, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you and Mr. Katko. I'm happy to have you leading our committee, and really proud to be back and to be subcommittee chair for the Intel and Counterterrorism committee. A lot of the issues that we're talking about today are going to be the bread and butter of that subcommittee, and they are sticky issues, complicated issues. I've started to discuss with my co-chair what an opportunity it is for our subcommittee and for this committee writ large to set an example that we as Democrats and Republicans can do our best at keeping this out of politics and focusing on protecting the American people. I think we have a real opportunity to demonstrate that. And I think it's important because for me, as someone who worked on preventing terrorist attacks on the United States for the first 20 years of my career, I believe the post 9/11 era is over. I think January 6th was the cap of one era and the beginning of another that makes clear that the most dangerous threat right now to us as Americans, physical threat, is the division between us and the way that some are exploiting those divisions. So I think it's good that we're having our first hearing on this, and we're going to be really diving into this in this new Congress. For those of us who are from Michigan, what happened on the 6th is extremely familiar. And in my district in particular, in April, we had armed protesters force their way into our Capitol. We had plots uncovered in my district where people were trying to kidnap and kill my governor. We've had a precipitous rise in groups like the Proud Boys and Boogaloo Boys, a 4-fold increase in anti-Semitic events in the state of Michigan. And then, of course, threats against elected leaders, myself and others on the screen. So I knew there was going to be violence on the 6th. I just didn't think it would be inside the Capitol. I thought it was going to be outside, which is why I directed my staff not to come to work that day. But there are legitimately complicated issues around domestic terrorism, because at its heart, it's about our fellow citizens. It's about our neighbors and making sure that civil liberties aren't rolled over. And some of these issues we brought up today, do we want a commission? Do we need a new domestic terrorism law? I think what's going to hold us steady in this committee is agreement on the definitions of terrorism versus extremism, and then the data, making sure that we're not expanding and exploding the numbers, the cases, the instances, that we use data, as FBI Director Wray came and testified in front of us last Congress, about what the real nature of the threat is. And we know, he said, that there are now more open domestic terrorism cases than foreign domestic cases, and that white supremacy constitutes the largest number of those domestic threats. One of those complicated issues some have talked about here, and it's the role of social media companies. It is very clear to me, we heard them testify last Congress, frankly, they could not get their act together. They could not come up with a common policy. They could not rise to the occasion of this new industry and talk about how they were going to protect the public. And then the pendulum swung after the 6th, and thousands of people have been kicked off social media platforms. So we heard from Jonathan Greenblatt on this. I'd like to hear from Ms. Newman on what you think we should do with the social media companies vis-a-vis domestic terrorism.
Thank you for the question, and congratulations on your chairmanship. I was pleased to see that you were appointed to that role. I agree with your assessment. They've dragged their feet too long. There are places where they have done really good work. It's just not enough. We need them to be moving faster. I am supportive, as others have mentioned, to looking at Section 230, in particular, what Congressman Malinowski proposed last session or the last Congress, that we need to explore the algorithms and the monetization of the algorithms. I think there are ways in which we can create incentive structures for them to do the right thing. I was also heartened by the Apple chairman, Tim Cook, in his comments last week. He also seemed to challenge the tech community. In the United States, we always prefer for industry to self-correct, but we might be at the point where it is needed for the Congress to not just hold a hearing, but potentially pass legislation to address this problem.
I know I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to working on those issues and the other sticky issues with this committee.
Thank you very much. I don't think there's any question about us looking at social media companies and whether or not they are being as forthright in managing those platforms as they should be. Chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson and Ranking Member Katko. Thank you for holding this meeting. Mr. Jenkins, you've had a storied career in the military with the Green Beret, and thank you for that service. But what is your opinion? We talked a lot about, incitement of violence and different things, but how does, when you have a Time magazine that publishes the defense of violent protest, when you have the Hatchet Book group published by the infamous Defense of Looting, when you have those calling for defunding the police, when you have cooperation and formation of sanctuary cities that don't cooperate with the police, what effect does this have on the extreme movements and their empowerment?
Mr. Norman, thank you very much for the question. Look, we protect in this country free speech. And a lot of that free speech is hateful, it is repugnant, but it is part of our country's history that we protect that. Number two, we protect the right of protest in this country. And we do so fiercely. And we realize that throughout our history, there's been a lot of pushing and shoving in terms of getting things done. So that has to be maintained. We can't destroy that. However, I think in the area of incitement, which is the word that you use, the courts have interpreted the incitement laws very narrowly, particularly applying the Brandenburg Rule, and I think in the age of social media, in the age of internet, in the age of this kind of communications technology that we have, that we do have to re-examine how we view incitement. Now, that is not to destroy free speech, that is not to destroy rights of protest, but I think that looking for too narrow of a connection between a specific word spoken by an individual and subsequent actions that take place, I think we do have to re-examine that. And I think we do. I would agree with the others. I'm cautious about new anti-terrorism legislation that leads us to deciding, well, you're a terrorist, this group is a terrorist, this group is a terrorist. That's going to be a long and futile argument. But examining these communications technologies and how these platforms run and rule themselves is something I think we have to do.
Let me take it a step further on, we've talked about what happened on the 6th to the Capitol. We had fences, we had a perimeter that were fortified by our Capitol Hill police. It ended up not being enough. But from your vantage point, were they given the enforcement measures, regardless of of what it was to stop people from coming in a Capitol that was clearly off limits. And what if the Green Berets had been there? What force would you describe that you would be authorized to take to stop it?
First, Mr. Norman, as a former soldier, I would desperately like to keep the military out of these civil terrorism, these domestic terrorism issues as much as possible. The National Guard is different, but if we're talking about the armed forces, if we're talking about Green Beret Special Forces, no, they do not have a role in dealing with domestic terrorism. We're not there. Insofar as putting that aside, the problem is that clearly the defenders of the Capitol were badly outnumbered. That was simply, I think it is that issue. Now, a commission can investigate this further, but just having a greater number of people on the exterior, as well as, and I think this is one thing that I don't see in the response, is that there should have been inner perimeters as well. In other words, the presumption that what if they break through that outer line? What if they break through the doors? Now we're dealing with them inside. Do we have prepared security within the Capitol building as opposed to around the Capitol building that will protect the officials and their staffs that are threatened by this action?
Yeah, but wouldn't it go to, I mean, the
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if I may, I'd like to associate myself with every word that you spoke in your opening statement. I totally concur with you. Let me start with this. My assumption is that all of our witnesses believe that there is something called white privilege. If I am incorrect, I would like for the witness who differs with me to say so. Is my assumption correct that all of our witnesses are associated, can have some understanding of what white privilege is? Hearing none, I assume that they do. I'd like to know, what role do you think white privilege played in the response that the officers had to the persons who marched on the Capitol, who stormed the Capitol, who, by many standards, participated in what was called an insurrection? So let me just start quickly and ask, we'll start with the Director of Homeland Security. Rodriguez, if you would, please.
Thank you, Congressman Green. And I know that there are a variety of investigations that are ongoing and commissioned by the Hill, and we will certainly find out the role that I think far right and white supremacy played in the insurrection. The FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office.
If I may just share just a thought with you, not white supremacy, white privilege. White privilege. What role did it play in the reception that those persons who marched on the Capitol received?
Well, Congressman, as I said, I think that that's going to come out a lot in the investigations that are ongoing as we speak.
All right. Is there anyone who has an opinion as to what role white privilege played? Yes, ma'am.
What I might offer, Mr. Congressman, is, as a civil rights organization that tracks these issues, we definitely have seen law enforcement not take quite as seriously when a bunch of young people get together with Confederate flags. They treat them very differently than a bunch of young men, boys or young men of color, when they get together. But I will just say that the failure of law enforcement to create a national security special event and adequately protect the Capitol on January the 6th contributed to what was nothing short of a catastrophe. There's no excuse for it. So I think white privilege may have played a role, but it was incompetence at the top, or maybe even a political decision that created the ultimate consequence that we're all dealing with today.
All right, and I'll yield to the lady next, please.
I echo what Mr. Greenblatt just said. It does appear that the nature of the threat, perhaps it's unwitting, perhaps it's, I wrote in my testimony that some of the challenge that we've had with this threat is that it wasn't taken seriously. It's really hard to understand fully everybody's motives behind that. I think one of the problems was the persistent use of the term lone wolf when you describe various attackers over the last 10 years associated with domestic extremism, and it kind of leaves you with this impression that they're kind of alone in their motivations, when in fact they are part of a massive movement. So we way underestimated this, what I believe to be the number of people in the country that are involved in the movement. They're not all violent, but in underestimating I think that led to some of the bad judgment calls. But yes, I do think that white privilege is a part of this.
Let me apologize for interrupting, but I want to ask you a follow-up question. If the persons who marched on the Capitol, and I'm being kind by saying marched in my opinion, were of color and had hockey sticks and nooses and swastikas, I'm told there may have been some, but let's say shirts with Auschwitz on them, would the reception have been the same? This is your best guess. Would it have been the same?
No. I think the evidence of even recent events like this last summer have showed that we treat threats differently based on the color of the protester skin, and that needs to change.
Which leads me to my final question. Do we need some sort of means by which we can educate? I would prefer not to use the term train, but educate the constabulary, those who are among the police and constables and sheriffs, all of these various departments, about something that we call an unconscious bias. Do we need to train and teach people about this? Ma'am?
Yeah.
Gentleman, time from Texas has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks, for 5 minutes.
I'm sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko. I'm delighted to be a member of this committee and look forward to working with all of you. I just had a question. We've heard from several of the witnesses about disinformation and specifically disinformation in social media. But I also want to ask Ms. Newman, very short answer, if you will. Do you feel that there was also different disinformation among the traditional media?
From time to time, the term of disinformation means intentional. I think what we were more often likely to see in traditional media is the misinformation, which is inaccurate information, but there's not an intentionality behind it. That often happens when things go viral, and it takes a while to circle back around and discover things aren't true. That is a common problem that we have in the society today.
Did you see on traditional media with police cars burning and being told by traditional media reporters and anchors that these were peaceful protests? And would that be considered disinformation or misinformation?
You know, if we're talking about the protests over the summer where there was rioting and in certain cities, is that what you're referencing?
Yes, ma'am.
The way that I consume a lot of different media, but the media I personally consumed seemed to frame this as we did have some places where there was violence. Some of it I would classify as traditional criminal riots, criminal actors taking advantage of a moment and or very angry and acting out their anger. It's illegal. It should be handled appropriately. We also had a number of right-wing violent extremists use protests as a cover for acceleration of violence. That's part of their ideology. Boogaloo Boys have been arrested. They were very prominent in some of the killings of law enforcement officers. And we saw online chatter anytime there was a planned protest of right-wing violent extremists using this as an opportunity to potentially cause acts of violence. I think the data, I might refer to the ADL, they might have better stats, but some of the data that's now coming out demonstrates that the preponderance of actual violence, intentional violence, as opposed to looting, was sadly more coming out of those right-wing violent extremist organizations, as opposed to what had been argued that it was Antifa. We, as far as I know, only have one incident of Antifa-related murder.
So thank you very much for that, acknowledging that there is misinformation and disinformation both within social media and in traditional media, both in what is covered and portrayed. Mr. Jenkins, there's a question about the National Guard and why it took so long for the National Guard to respond. Would it be fair to say that the National Guard is made up of individuals who are not stationed at a post or a base? They are not stationed collectively together, that they have to be called upon to be activated, and that would cause a delay? They're not like a police SWAT team where they can immediately respond to an incident?
That is true, that normally the National Guard are at their homes and are summoned to deal with various types of emergencies. However, as we have seen in the cases during the summer and in preparation for other events in Washington, National Guard units are mobilized in advance to be on standby. They may not be visible, but they are mobilized, they are in the area and can readily respond. I don't know the reasons for the delay in the response on January 6th, but the fact that members of the National Guard in their normal civilian lives are scattered is not one of the reasons. We have seen them mobilized to stand by before.
Thank you. And throughout this, I've heard of disinformation on the attacks on January 6th. And I'm just wondering if people have investigated or looked at irregularities in voting that could have perpetuated disinformation. Have we had that oversight investigation yet, to your knowledge?
I don't know that we have had that investigation. If I understand your question correctly, I mean, in terms of the irregularities in the voting, there have been numerous investigations by the state authorities, which run the elections, in ensuring that there is an accurate count of the vote and that the elections can be certified. Are you talking about an investigation beyond that?
I was just wondering if any of the, if you had looked into irregularities or complaints of regularities. So thank you.
No, I have not.
Thank you very much. I yield my time.
Thank you. The House Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your continued strong, fair, and inclusive leadership. Today's hearing is quite timely, and I'd like to acknowledge my fellow New Yorker. It's great to have you serving as ranking member of this extremely crucial subcommittee, excuse me. I continue to extend my condolences to the family, friends, and loved ones of Capitol Police Officer Sicknick. He lost his life protecting our lives. And I and the people of the 9th District of New York prayerfully stand with you, with their family during this season of bereavement. Last Congress, one of the focuses of this committee was to highlight the threat of domestic terrorism. With terrifying frequency, we've seen white supremacist terrorists terrorize our communities. And until January 20th of last month, We had a federal government that refused to take the threat seriously enough to address it. In effect, complicit with the exponential rise of these terrorist organizations. Just a few short weeks ago, this rising tide of white supremacist domestic terror combined forces with another dangerous force. Donald Trump's efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The result was an attempted coup, orchestrated by none other than Donald Trump himself, and an insurrection at the Capitol as we gathered to elect and certify the election of Joe Biden as our new president. We cannot parse words. This was an act of domestic terrorism, an attack on our citadel of democracy. It was incited and operationalized by Donald Trump. There are members and senators in this body who voted to overturn the results of the election, even after the very building where we work was attacked. Yes, this was an intelligence failure. Yes, this was a security failure, but even more troubling, this was a societal failure. Until we put to rest the lies about the election, the conspiracy theories like QAnon, and the racist ideologies that drive so many towards hate, we will not be safe. As I mentioned, actions of these domestic terrorists are directly linked to the words of President Trump. For 2 months, he promoted the lie after lie about the election, fraud, and demanded that they, quote unquote, stop the steal. So my question, Mr. Jenkins, is do you agree with my assessment that Donald Trump is directly responsible for and must be held accountable for what happened on January 6th?
Going to be disappointed in my answer, not because it is contrary to the events as you have laid out, but look, we have congressional investigations taking place. We have criminal investigations taking place. We have an impeachment trial beginning next week.
I have a short period of time. If it's yes, it's yes. If it's no, it's no.
It is neither. It is,
okay.
That is a political question which I cannot.
Very well. It's a practical question, but be that as it may, it is no secret that white supremacist groups such as the Proud Boys were key players in the attack on January 6th. This is not an isolated incident. From Charleston to El Paso to Pittsburgh to Wellington, deadly white supremacist attacks have become the norm, not the exception. So my question is, and this is for any of our panelists, let me direct it to Jonathan Greenblatt. What explains this surge in hate, and what role has presidential rhetoric played in fostering it over the last 4 years? And what additional steps can the new administration take to prioritize this deadly threat?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Clark. It's nice to see you. I would say a few quick points. So number one, I mean, fighting hate previously was not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It was a bipartisan issue. That changed in the last 4 years when the prior president, indeed, from the rhetoric he used on the campaign in 2015 and 2016, when he would retweet white supremacists, and he would use their language, terms like globalists and whatnot, and George Soros. That created the conditions in which they felt encouraged. So number one, it was a failure of leadership. And again, to call them out clearly, consistently, cogently, after Charlottesville, after the debate every time. Number two, the extremists felt emboldened, Congresswoman, and they leapt into the vacuum that he created, and they recruited, they did more public events, they ran for office, and they really exploited social media. So they felt emboldened. And number three, social media. Again, the tech companies have been far too lax and lazy about enforcing their own terms of service. They do not, as business, have to abide by the First Amendment. But even then, freedom of expression isn't the freedom to incite violence. And what's happened in the past 30 days, taking off the worst actors, Congresswoman, it should have happened years ago. Social media should abide by the same standards as any business and give no quarter to those people who would commit violence against Jews, African Americans, or any other marginalized community in this country.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Harshberger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to introduce myself to the committee today. I am Diana Harshberger, and I represent the 1st District of Tennessee, which is East Tennessee. And as a healthcare provider and pharmacist for the past 30 years, I really appreciate being put on this committee because, you know, I understand the national security threats of having over 90% of our finished pharmaceutical products and our chemicals that we use to make those products come outside of the United States of America, and in a lot of cases from adversarial nations, as a matter of fact. And it took the COVID pandemic to open a lot of people's eyes as to the problem that we have with this. And what we need to do is get domestic supply chains into this country so we won't have to worry about that, you know, because we have an over-reliance to those foreign adversarial countries for that supply chain. And in my district of East Tennessee, we have a couple of different things as far as national security threats to infrastructure. I have nuclear fuel services, which works closely with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And I also have Holston Army Ammunition Plant in my district. And I wanted just to comment on something that Mr. Jenkins said, and he's made the statement that the defenders of the Capitol were woefully outnumbered and we need to investigate this. And I would hope, honestly, that we would be able to do that, to see if there was any information exchange between the Capitol Police, the DC Mayor, and the FBI. And, you know, that's of utmost importance. And also everything that has been said about Section 230 and taking that immunity away from these social media companies, that is imperative. And I look forward to working with my colleagues on things that would help with national security and both foreign and domestic. And I yield the remainder of my time back, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jenkins, are you want to respond? I can go to the next questioner.
Just very, very quickly. I mean, the public statements made by various officials in the FBI, Capitol Police, District Police are somewhat contradictory as to who knew what when. That is, to what degree the warnings that were seen, in some cases produced by specific parties, were shared with other parties. That has to be an issue for the commission. I don't have personal knowledge to sort that out now. Insofar as the inadequate numbers, again, this was inadequate preparation. Why this was not already indicated as a special event requiring the coordination of all of the authorities and resources available, as, for example, the inauguration or the President's State of the Union address. Again, that is something that has to be investigated. Was it impeded? Was it poor planning? Was it bad decisions? I don't know.
Thank you. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. From Nevada, from Las Vegas, I'm no stranger, or we are no strangers to this whole problem of domestic terrorism. We've had a U.S. Forest Service building bombed in Carson City. We had the Bundy armed standoff against the BLM over their illegal grazing of cattle on public lands. He's since commented that you needed to get the work done. You can't drain the swamp by standing off to the side, and encouraged more people to turn out for Donald Trump's rally and attack on the Capitol. And when I flew home after that incident that was so terrible that we all watched in horror, there were people on the plane with me who had obviously come from Nevada to attend that. They were sharing pictures on their phone. They were talking about it. They were wearing masks that had derogatory comments on it. So that just leads me to ask Ms. Newman the question about the screening of terrorists on airlines. We've heard that many of the people there maybe were already on the FBI's terrorist screening database, known as the terrorist watch list, but that sometimes results in additional screening or not, but doesn't necessarily mean that these people end up on the no-fly list, which is managed by DHS. Just tell me if that's correct or not, and tell me if there'd be any value in maybe redesigning or certainly looking at that comparison to see if we should put them on the no-fly list. You mentioned it just briefly in your statements, but could you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yes, ma'am. The no-fly list is very explicitly for individuals that the intelligence community assesses pose a threat to aviation. So if in their assessment an individual poses a threat, that alone does not put you on a no-fly list. The second thing is that the purpose of the watch list, there are individuals that are known terrorists and there are individuals that are suspected terrorists, and then there are associations, meaning we don't quite know, but there's reason to believe that there might be associations that lead us to believe we need to screen this person more effectively before we allow them to receive an immigration benefit or board a plane or seek some other type of activity. The watch list in particular was designed for screening and vetting purposes, but it was designed at a time that we were primarily concerned about terrorists over there trying to get to us over here. Mm-hmm. I do know that there has been efforts to update and figure out if within existing authorities, the watch list screening and vetting apparatus is able to apply it to anybody that has met the criteria to join the watch list. So I know that they're doing as much as they can, but it would be a good thing to talk to DHS, maybe have some closed door briefings to see if they have ideas of authorities that might help them be able to go do those things. That's part of the reason why I think there at least needs to be a discussion about a designation. I recognize that is fraught with peril, as Mr. Jenkins has pointed out, but some of the tools that we have in our toolkit at DHS would be more effective if there were some clear ways in which you determine who is designated and who is not. So I just believe it needs to be discussed. I don't have my own opinion yet of what the right answer is. Lastly, I just want to point out there were a lot of conversations or media reports that people had been booted off of planes because they were quote unquote on the no-fly list. I believe that was misunderstood. Airlines have the ability to make decisions about who they allow on their planes for certain reasons, and if they had been no-fly listed, they wouldn't have been allowed into the secure area past TSA screening. So most likely those circumstances probably are a little different as opposed to saying that people had already been no-fly listed.
Well, thank you for that. I think we definitely need to look into it, because if we do come with some other kind of designation, TSA is going to have to be trained, airports are going to have to figure out how to accommodate that, and it would be a pretty big project, but certainly maybe one worthwhile to pursue. So thank you. Just briefly, I'd follow up on Mr. Correa's question about fusion centers. You know, Las Vegas has the best private security in the world. We've got the eye in the sky, watching everything that goes on along the strip and in gaming casinos that are so regulated. I wonder if these fusion centers are taking advantage of cooperating or working with or setting up some kind of plan to interact with private security. Anybody? Maybe
Yes,
Mr. Rodriguez?
Representative Titus. Yes, I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in that environment, and certainly building out the fusion center capabilities to work closer with the private sector is one of them. Yes, there's a lot more work that can be done.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Jimenez from Florida for 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it certainly is a pleasure for me to be here. It's my first committee meeting, and I'm very honored to work with you and the ranking member on this most important topic. If we, want to work in a bipartisan manner, and I don't think if we can't agree to work in a bipartisan manner on Homeland Security, I don't know what we can agree on. So I have a couple of questions that I'd like to get to. I know that we have a lot of topics, but I want to really home in on what happened on the 6th here at the Capitol. And Mr. Rodriguez, is the Capitol Police part of the DC Fusion Center?
The DC Fusion Center has representatives at the U.S. Capitol Police, sir.
All right. And did you have any information that that indicated that that there was a significant event about to happen on January 6th?
Sir, as I've stated, we've had intelligence to suggest that there would be violence in the city on January 6th. And recall that there was some indication that there might be protests on the 4th and the 5th as well, which didn't materialize to the level that we had anticipated. But we did have indications that there would be violence on the 6th, yes.
Was the National Guard offered to the Capitol Police?
Sir, from the city standpoint, we're not responsible for security at the Capitol. So that would have to be a question for the Capitol Police. From the city, we did request the National Guard, and we did receive National Guard resources in response to the threats that we were seeing.
I understand that that's something that the Capitol Police may have to respond to, but do you have any knowledge that the National Guard actually offered their help to the Capitol Police for the 6th?
Not prior to the 6th, sir. No, I do not.
Okay. To Ms. Newman, you said there was poor judgment, and poor judgment was exhibited. Who exhibited the poor judgment?
I will leave it to the investigation to show, but it just makes no sense to me that there were so few, such a low law enforcement presence at the Capitol, that there wasn't a stronger perimeter security, that those law enforcement officers present didn't have riot gear. They're just basic things that we have learned over the last 20 years, that a strong deterrence often avoids violence, and that was not present on January 6th. So somewhere somebody made a bad judgment call.
Okay, and back to Mr. Rodriguez. Do you know what the rules of engagement were that the Capitol Police was given?
No, sir, I do not. That's a question for the Capitol Police.
What are your rules of engagement when you are, look, I was the mayor of Miami-Dade County. We saw some disturbances in Miami back in June, July. But my rules of engagement were very, very direct to my director. As mayor, I'm also happen to be the sheriff, okay, of Miami-Dade. And my rules of engagement were, we will protect everybody's right to protest. But once they leave that boundary and now they go into violence, there's no zero tolerance. And so they tested us the first night, and they went into what's called Bayside, a very popular tourist site. And Miami-Dade police went in and made sure that those people that were rummaging through Bayside were arrested and dispersed. What are the rules? What are the rules of engagement here in DC concerning protesters? The right to protest, and then once they cross that boundary.
So, sir, as a sheriff, you'll appreciate the answer, which is I'm not going to speak for the Metropolitan Police Department, but we can get you that information on their rules of engagement from the police department.
And you don't know, obviously, you also don't know what the Capitol Police's rules of engagement were for the 6th.
No, sir, that would have to be for the Capitol Police.
Fair enough. Okay, I think I've got sufficient. One more question to Ms. Newman. You said that we needed a law, and I agree with you. I think we do need a law concerning terrorism, all kinds of terrorism. And in Florida, they're looking at upping significantly the penalties for people that break the law while they are protesting. In other words, they go outside the bounds of just protesting, and now they start to create violence, destruction, etc. If we do in fact have a federal law, how would you think that we would standardize the enforcement of those laws? Say if in a particular area the leadership, the political leadership, actually agreed with the philosophy or the ideology of the people that were protesting?
I mean, that's one of the very real challenges of going into strengthening our domestic terrorism laws, right? The threat is what it is today, but as has already been discussed, 50 years ago, it looked different, and we have to presume 50 years from now, it will look different again. I think the critical factor is the violence associated with it. Clearly, given the experience we've just had, I would love to see an exploration of how we might be able to hold even our political officials accountable, either criminally or civilly, for incitement to violence. I think we need to send a strong signal that if you are choosing to take an oath of office, if you are choosing to take a leadership role in our society, that you have to be responsible for the words that you use. We do have individuals in this country that are both, we certainly have people that are mentally unwell. We also have people that are just vulnerable, maybe not definably mentally ill, but are vulnerable to disinformation. They're vulnerable to their grievances being fed. We have seen over the last 5 years this increase in hateful political rhetoric, and examples of it happening on the left as well as obviously a lot on the right. So I think that we may need to have an examination of what else could we do to encourage our elected officials and other leaders to be more responsible for their words.
I agree with you on both the left and the right. Thank you, and I yield my time.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the young lady from New Jersey for 5 minutes, Ms. Watson Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member. Congratulations to both of you, and thank you for this really important hearing. I appreciate the information that has been shared and the concerns that have been raised. I have a couple of observations, and I certainly have a question for former New Jerseyan Dr. Rodriguez. First of all, I want to say that we all were pretty scared on January 6th and fearing for our lives. And we all had some idea that things were really bad behind in the hallways and in the rooms. And we were closeted in various places. And perhaps we were safe, or maybe not so much, depending upon what happened to us with COVID. But we knew that this was serious. And we knew also that this was a breach. This was an insurrection against our government. And here's my concern. I agree that rhetoric is bad. I agree that inflaming incitement happened on that day in the ellipse. I agree that the higher up the rhetoric comes from, the more intense it is experienced and the more action that it provokes. I also think that things that happen afterwards were equally as important. And two of the things that concern me particularly is the way these thugs were treated breaching the Capitol, predominantly white, female, and male, and how other protesters of color have been treated in our Capitol, and also after the fact. We've got two examples of white women brought before judges who were given what I consider the ultimate white privilege in what happened to them. And the first one was a young woman who stole the laptop and threatened Nancy Pelosi. She was given an ankle bracelet and sent home to her mommy. The second one was a woman who owns a small business and had tickets to go to Mexico. She's given permission from the court to leave the country to go to Mexico. Yet there are young people in prison right now for stealing backpacks, for having small drug offenses that are people of color. This disparity in justice at all levels sickens me, and this latest manifestation of this white supremacy, this white privilege is just gotta stop. We had a gathering of the most diverse group of people who hate something in the whole country in the Capitol on January the 6th. You know what I find the common thread was that brought them together? The former president of the United States, Donald Trump. So if they were anti-government, they were pro-Donald Trump. If they were anti-Black or anti-Semitic or anti-LGBTQ or whatever they were against, they were pro-Trump. And so the common thread there was Donald Trump, and he needs to be held accountable. Mr. Rodriguez, I've got a question for you. I want to know, how early did you have information that we were possibly going to experience the kind of violence that we did experience, either the 4th, the 5th, or the 6th? And what agencies were you communicating with specifically, and what were their responses? Because I don't think that this was a lack of intelligence. I think this was a lack of a desire to do what they needed to do to keep this Congress safe, to keep our leadership safe, and to have enough resources to push back what became an insurrection. And I want everyone accountable. And before you answer that question, I have one more issue. And that is, I don't know if we need more legislation or if we need more enforcement of existing legislation. And I look forward to that investigation, that kind of commission consideration, so that we know where we should go. We can't jump before we know. We need to know before we jump. So, Mr. Rodriguez, could you please, in the time that I have left, answer the question, when did you know? Who did you tell, and what was their response? I want to know specifically what agencies you communicated with.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. It's good to see you again, and I appreciated working with you when I was the director in New Jersey. We saw indications that there would be violence for the 4th, 5th, and the 6th in the middle of December. I'll caveat that by saying that we had known that there would be, or at least seen initial indications of intelligence that there would be violence around the election period. And we were planning, and we briefed Mayor Bowser on this, that we could see protracted violence through the inaugural period. And so as we began to brief, and that's why the mayor called up the National Guard, that's why she activated the Emergency Operations Center, that's why we activated our Fusion Center.
Did you communicate with anyone up higher than the local government? I want to know how far up
Yes.
in the federal government, the state government, the FBI, the Capitol Police, whoever. I want to know who knew what you thought was going to happen.
Yes, ma'am. As you know, it's an information sharing process. It's an iterative process. FBI, Secret Service, U.S. Capitol Police, U.S. Police, our Metropolitan Police Department, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Intelligence and Analysis. So all of those entities we communicated with on the potential violence and the threat. And I think it's important also, if I could just say one last thing, Congresswoman, is that as an intelligence analyst by trade, the issue here was not the lack of intelligence or the lack of information. The issue here was the inability or the unwillingness to act on the intelligence.
Amen. Amen. And that's where the accountability needs to take place. And I think Ms. Newman.
Young ladies from New Jersey's time has expired.
You know, I gently yield back. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, may I speak just for a moment?
Yes, Chair recognizes the ranking member.
There's been repeated questions about what happened that day and how we're going to get to the bottom of it. And I just want to reiterate that I have a bill out there that does exactly this. And I think it's really important, and it'll be incumbent upon members of the committee, I think, to join on to the bill and get that bill passed so we can get this commission up and running and find out, because I think until we do that, we're going to have a hard time really understanding where the shortfall was here and where people fell down. So with that, I'll just yield back. Thank you, sir.
I agree.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia for 5 minutes, Mr. Clyde. You need to unmute yourself, Representative. I think there's some technical issues around Representative Clyde's We'll go to Mr. LaTurner while Mr. Clyde gets his technical challenges corrected. Mr. LaTurner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I want to say to you, this is my first meeting, and want to say to you and the ranking member and all the colleagues that I'm honored to be on this committee. I look forward to working with you on the very serious issues that this committee has jurisdiction over. It is my sincere belief, and I hope that that it rings true as we go through this process, that national security issues should not be partisan. I hope we can work together and make sure that we're working on behalf of the American people. My question is for Ms. Newman. I have a couple of them. The first thing that I would like you to talk about, you talked about January 6th was an inspiration point and would be an inspiration point for 10 to 20 years. So I'd like for you to talk about the concept of it being an inspiration point. Have you seen evidence of that, and where the time frame of 10 to 20 years comes from?
Thanks for the question. We have seen on January 6th and in the month since then, online chatter that indicates that white supremacist groups and anti-government groups in particular view this as a rallying point. I don't want to say a starting pistol because they've existed for so long and have had this ideology of eventually overthrowing the U.S. government. If you're a white supremacist, you want to establish this white homeland within the United States. But it's certainly this moment where for many this fantasy was finally coming true. And they one of the examples is that in the Turner Diaries, there's an attack on the Capitol. It's different than what we saw on January 6th, but many cited that scene out of the Turner Diaries, which is, if folks watching are not familiar, is a horrible book about white supremacists basically taking over the world. But there's this scene where they attack the Capitol, and that's like the starting point for eventually leading to societal collapse and leading to nuclear war, and then you're able to start over and have a white homeland. So sadly, some view this as a huge success, even though it only lasted a few hours. They see the terror that it caused. They see that it was easy to do, and they believe that this is their moment, that they may actually be able to lead us into a civil war. So that some of the concern is that those that belong to those types of ideology are going to be inspired to try to bring more violence so that they can eventually reach that civil war state. The other factor here is that you have such a large group of people that are unaffiliated with these terrorist movements or terrorist organizations, but they're very vulnerable right now. They're just disheartened QAnon followers, for example, or former Trump supporters who really thought that something was going to happen on January 6th and Trump was going to remain president. They are very vulnerable, and we actively see neo-Nazis recruiting Trump supporters to their ideology. They're very sophisticated in how they do it. They don't come right at you. You don't necessarily know you're talking to a white supremacist. So the concern I have is that we may see more mainstreaming of this fringe right ideology, and from that you're going to have larger numbers of people, not necessarily that are all the way to the violent spectrum, end of the spectrum, but the more you have in the radicalized section of that graph, the more likely you are to see acts of violence. And then lastly, you asked about the generational struggle. In talking with extremist experts, most of them see this as one of those moments in our history where it's going to inspire and encourage people for quite some time, and that's why I gave that time period.
The other thing I want to ask you really quick, because my time's running out, is the problem that I very much acknowledge is the social isolation that makes people more vulnerable to these kinds of arguments. And as I'm sure you'd agree with me, this is going to exist after COVID is over. It'll get better, but this has been a growing problem for the last couple of decades with the rise of what's in all of our pockets. That's a contributing factor. And we can't pass a law to make people get to know and care about their neighbor. And so what is the future of this social isolation, and what can be done about it? Where do you see it going?
A couple of thoughts. One, I do think when the restrictions related to the pandemic and hopefully later this year, some of the challenge that we're facing right now will lessen a bit. So that's some bright news and an otherwise dark assessment. But you're absolutely right. We are increasingly isolated. This isn't a problem that has been documented for, going back at least 2 decades. And it is not one government can solve. I wrote in my written testimony, really is so far beyond anything that the security industry can solve or the government can solve. We really need to ask citizens and leaders within our neighborhoods and within our communities to stand up and decide that they want a country that looks different than the current moment that we're in. And it does require changes in the faith community. It requires changes in the tech community. It requires changes maybe within our education system. I personally don't think, I am a conservative, I don't think that's coming from the federal government. I think what makes America great is when it comes from organically from grassroots. And I think there are so many amazing men and women in this country that love their country and don't want another January 6th attack. And we need to encourage them to step up and serve their communities and demonstrate the good that we still have in this country and push back the darkness and the violence and the hateful rhetoric.
Thank you, Ms. Newman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes, Ms. Barragan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying that I appreciate every member of Congress in this committee that believes that 9/11 is real and that it happened. I never thought I would have to actually say that, but I have much greater appreciation now. And so I wanted to start by thanking my colleagues on this committee for believing and agreeing that it occurred and that we're doing everything we can to stop another domestic terrorism attack or those coming from foreign terrorists from coming to our country. Ms. Newman and Mr. Greenblatt, questions for you. The FBI called QAnon a domestic terror threat. How dangerous is it for members of Congress to support these domestic terror groups and repeat their lies? Ms. Newman.
QAnon has certainly accelerated as a threat, particularly over the summer. I think a lot of that has to do with what we were just talking about, social isolation, the pandemic, people searching for answers for why their lives had been turned upside down and seeking for a way to take control. It is really hard to extract people once they really go down the rabbit hole. So it is really important for anybody in a position of authority, particularly those that are considered a credible voice, which is often a pastor or a media personality or an elected member of Congress. It's really important that they talk about what truth is and what is not truth. Even if in QAnon, it's a lot of asking questions like, well, suppose, or what if, you know what, like that's gossip and slander. And we need to kind of go back to the basics of we don't bear false witness. If you don't have a firsthand account of the conspiracy that you think is true, then you probably don't need to be spreading it. And I think we need to help encourage our citizens to get back to the basics of civic society.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt.
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I would say dangerous conspiracy theories from 9/11 truthers to the Sandy Hook kind of people to QAnon are all part of a piece. They are a danger to our national security and they are a danger to our communities. So the QAnon folks demonstrate anti-Semitism, they demonstrate racism, they demonstrate demonizing other people, suggesting that Democrats are pedophiles or part of some conspiracy to kill and eat children. All of it is disgusting. And whether you are an elected member of Congress or some other office, or you're an aspirant, whether you say it now or you said it in the past, it should disqualify you from being on committees or participating in it. If you believe that our democracy is being taken over by pedophiles and you subscribe to these crazy theories about Jewish space lasers, you don't belong at the table. Period. End of story.
And Mr. Greenblatt, what message will it send if there are no consequences?
It is baffling how no matter what party you're a part of, no matter how you choose to pull the lever in the ballot box, that people would think that someone who believes such crazy, outrageous lies should be part of a political process, who thinks that Sandy Hook didn't happen should sit on an education committee. It boggles the mind and it undermines the credibility of whatever party would choose to do that and the political process overall.
Thank you very much. Now, often the role of women in extremist groups or movements is overlooked or underplayed. What role have women played in growing domestic terrorist movements over the past 4 years, and what role did they play in the January 6th attack? Ms. Newman, do you want to start?
I actually think my colleagues might have better answers to that. It's a really good question, though.
Okay.
So, Congresswoman, if I might, so ADL has studied extremists for decades. First of all, I would say there is a clear link between white supremacy and misogyny. So we should just point out right up front that white supremacist rhetoric and extremist rhetoric often demeans and denigrates women. And I'd be happy to send you and all the members of the committee our reporting and analysis on this. Secondly, it's also worth letting you know that women can be radicalized just like men. And QAnon and conspiracy theories, disinformation campaigns aren't just, if you will, the portion of one gender. And we watched, the ADL has watched all these extremists as they converged on the Capitol, and there were women and men among the crowd. And we know that young woman was killed when she tried to literally burst into the chamber of the speaker. So women are often denigrated by these movements, and yet they can be brainwashed and radicalized just like anyone else.
Great, thank you. And with that, my time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields back. Chair again recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 5 minutes. We still can't hear the gentleman from Georgia. Right. We'll wait on the technical correction for the gentleman from Georgia again. We'll go to the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Kamek, for 5 minutes.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I am honored to join the Homeland Security Committee and look forward to working with members of this committee, this Congress, to ensure the security of our nation. I also want to thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for continuing the tradition of bipartisanship and addressing the issues and threats facing our national security. Because of COVID restrictions, I haven't had the opportunity to meet all of my colleagues on this committee and wanted to take a brief moment to introduce myself. I proudly represent Florida's 3rd Congressional District, which I affectionately refer to as the Gator Nation, North Central Florida. And the issue of Homeland Security is a personal and passionate issue for myself, having graduated from the United States Naval War College with a master's degree in information operations and counterterrorism. Additionally, for nearly a decade, I have worked closely with law enforcement and first responders throughout the state of Florida, and I am keenly aware of the issues that they face on a daily basis. In fact, my husband is a SWAT medic and a first responder for Gainesville Fire Rescue in our hometown. Together, we have created a nonprofit organization called the GRIT Foundation, which serves to provide critical life-saving equipment to our departments. That experience over the last few years has given me critical insight into how we can better serve and protect our communities by bolstering resources for first responders rather than cutting them. I'm also honored to serve as the ranking member on the subcommittee for emergency preparedness, response, and recovery, along with Chairwoman and fellow Floridian Val Demings. I look forward to the work that we will do there. But turning now to the events of January 6th and the broader issue that we have been facing, which is extremism and domestic terrorism. As someone who witnessed the attack personally from the House floor, I have been vocal about condemning the attacks of that day, just as I have been very vocal about condemning the violence that we witnessed in Portland, Minneapolis, DC, Denver, and beyond last year. I personally spent the following days after the attack speaking to law enforcement and custodial staff that was present there with us that day. And that brings me to the conclusion that there is no doubt in my mind that the events of that day were premeditated and that a thorough and complete investigation that is extraordinarily transparent is needed, which is why I'm very proud to support Ranking Member Katko and Representative Davis's efforts to create a 9/11 style commission to investigate the events leading up to January 6th. I would be remiss if I did not make note of the fact that several of our colleagues have continued to ratchet up divisive political rhetoric. For example, insinuating that fellow members have been complicit in the planned violence of that awful day, January 6th. We must also speak out against more than 570 protests last year that turned violent, resulting in 2,385 looting incidents, 624 arson incidents, and more than 2,000 police officers that have been injured. Baseless and continual accusations are not helpful. We must denounce racism, we must denounce hate, and we must denounce violence regardless of its origins. We need to collectively hold these criminals accountable that stormed the Capitol to the fullest extent of the law. And I believe that we as Americans are bigger than the divisive rhetoric that continues today. I believe that we are bigger than the events of January 6th. We are bigger and stronger than the challenges that we face as a republic. So I know that I'm limited here on time. I am going to turn this to Mr. Jenkin and ask, I know that you've touched on this a bit today, but I wanted to bring up this important issue again. How does government and the members of this committee here best move forward in preventing extremism and domestic terrorism while preserving all Americans' First Amendment rights and privacy?
Thank you very, very much for the question. I think that there are a couple of things that you do. One, I again come back to the issue of a commission would be a most useful thing to start with a full exploration of the events of January 6th and what happened then. I think a second thing I've already heard repeated a number of times from my colleagues on the panel and from you members of Congress, and that is to try to recover some of the comity that has been a hallmark of this nation, and to reduce the bellicose rhetoric going forward. Put aside the issues of the past for a moment. Looking ahead, we still have people in this country talking about civil war. I'm talking about high-ranking officials in state governments and elsewhere, talking about civil war, talking about succession, talking about loading up with ammunition. That kind of rhetoric isn't going to help us going forward. It has nothing to do with going after and prosecuting those responsible for violence. They should be prosecuted wherever they're coming from on the political spectrum. But we certainly, as part of our national strategy, need to bring it down a notch and to try to set the standards for how we're going to communicate with one another.
Gentleladies from Florida's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottenheimer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it is an honor to be on this committee, and I want to thank you for welcoming me, and I'm grateful to be here and looking forward to serving together with all of my fellow members on both sides of the aisle. In the wake of the unprecedented terrorist attack on the Capitol, we've seen detailed reports, thanks to the Anti-Defamation League, of the involvement of despicable and dangerous extremist groups, such as the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the New Jersey European Heritage Association, the Proud Boys, and others, which were on the ground that day. Ms. Newman, if I can ask you a question, what do you believe is the single most impactful thing we can do right now to stamp out these groups?
When you limit it to right now, I mean, most of the prevention work that interacts with individuals, helping them to either not radicalize, or if they are radicalized, to kind of off-ramp them from violence, that takes a long time. And the capabilities that we have in the country are limited. They're scaling. I think we can scale faster. That's something I noted in my comments that I hope to see you all take up. But we have very limited resources to do the one-on-one individual work that we really need to get after this problem, from a comprehensive perspective. So if I look at the moment right now, the best thing would be if we can clarify that the election was not stolen from credible voices. That reduces the vulnerable and reduces then the pool from which perhaps people get recruited into a Proud Boys or a Boogaloo Boys or a neo-Nazi group. That is probably the single most thing that we could do. And then the other thing is we've got to make sure that our protective systems are there. It's been a while since we've had mass gatherings. I think as summer comes, we'll be outside. There'll be more people. Hopefully the pandemic is starting to wane. And that will create targets of opportunity. Now is the time to encourage critical infrastructure owners and operators of any sort of event venue, malls, restaurants, to dust off those plans, make sure that you have your protective measures. If you haven't exercised them in a while, you should do it now.
There seems to be, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here. There seems to be a difference of opinion about whether we need a statute criminalizing domestic terrorism or not. But without a federal law, given the failure to enforce laws in most states criminalizing paramilitary activity, won't these groups continue to openly gather and threaten our communities if we don't take this action?
Yes, and in particular, I love that you pulled out the militia piece. That is something that we could probably make an impact on rather quickly if we could do some sort of coordinated public advisory, public communication effort to educate people that it is illegal to participate in a private militia, that is not Second Amendment activity. I won't get into all of the nuance, and there are experts out there that, especially at Georgetown, that have put together the campaign that we would need to be able to educate people in the states. But I think there's a ton of misinformation out there, people thinking that it is perfectly legal and constitutional for them to join these militia. And once you're in that group, it is easier for individuals to potentially follow that pathway to something violent. If we can educate people that private militias are not legal. And second step, as you suggested, if we could pass a federal law that makes that even more clear, that would be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Mr. Greenblatt, for years, the ADL has diligently detailed the rise in anti-Semitism. And of course, the rise in anti-Semitism and violent extremism are intertwined. For instance, we were all sickened and horrified to see a man on the Capitol on January 6th wearing a hoodie with the words Camp Auschwitz on the front and staff on the back. I saw others the days before wearing other shirts with anti-Semitic slurs across them. How is the failure to contain and confront virulent and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories like QAnon and accelerationism led us not just to the lone wolf attacks in Pittsburgh and Poway, but to the insurrection here at the Capitol on January 6th?
Well, thank you for the question, Mr. Congressman. I think we know that anti-Semitism is literally at the root of white supremacy, and that it courses through right-wing extremism as an underlying theory of the case. They believe that Jewish groups, that Jewish people are somehow controlling, manipulating the levers of power, government, Wall Street, Hollywood, the media. I could go on. And we need to, law enforcement needs to recognize this and to see those symbols. The likes what you mentioned were on display at the Capitol. And by the way, the ADL maintains an open source database of extremist symbols. You can find it at adl.org. We need law enforcement to utilize these things, take advantage of the information that we have, so that when they arrest someone and they see patches on their jacket or tattoos on them that indicate an affiliation with anti-Semitic, racist, white supremacist groups, they treat them appropriately. I think the question was asked earlier by the congressman from Texas about white privilege. We need to treat these hate mongers, these extremists like the criminals that they are. And look, as a First Amendment, as a civil rights organization, Congressman, that deeply believes in the First Amendment, I have no problem with hate speech, even if I don't like it. But when people seek not hate, not just hate, but to cause harm, that's a clear and present danger that needs to be dealt with to the fullest extent of the law.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time from New Jersey has expired.
Thanks. I yield back. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 5 minutes. Unmute yourself.
Okay. All right, third time the charm here.
Third time's a charm.
Great, thank you. Thank you for holding this important hearing, and thank you for the witnesses for coming out today. First, I must remind the members of the committee of the president's own words during the demonstrations held on January the 6th. President Trump said, and I quote, "I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard." Our president called for peaceful and patriotic protest here at the Capitol, which is the right of every American citizen. And that is one of the reasons I did not support and I voted against the sham impeachment of President Trump. There was no investigation. There were no witnesses called. There was no cross-examination. Nothing was consistent with any prior impeachment precedent. And that was wrong. Our nation is a nation of law and order, and I think everyone will agree with that. And that includes the right of due process for everyone, including the president. Mr. Greenblatt, my question is for you. Your comments about screening members of the military, and I'm a proud member of the military. I served 28 years in the Navy, including 3 combat tours, both active and reserve. But your comments about screening the members of the military, law enforcement, and every government position, including those in elected office, are very concerning to me. This smacks of the thought police. We are Americans. We respect every person's right to their own opinions, especially those with which we do not agree. We all raised our hand and swore to the same oath of office. So, Mr. Greenblatt, do you agree that people can have differing opinions on issues and ideologies, but those differences will not affect the jobs that they do for our country, be it in the military, be it in law enforcement, or be it in political office?
So, Mr. Congressman, first, let me just thank you for your service. I appreciate not just your service as a member of Congress, but your service in the U.S. military. I'm the son of a veteran of the U.S. Army, and I have only the highest respect. And I have family members who are in law enforcement. I have only the highest respect for people in public service. And again, as a civil rights organization who deeply believes in free speech, I fully appreciate and fiercely protect the right of Americans to have different opinions, even those that I don't like. But freedom of speech is not the freedom to commit sedition. And let's just be clear. Let me just.
I said different opinions and ideologies.
But Mr. Congressman, at the ADL, we track extremists. It was mentioned earlier by Ms. Newman. We know for a fact that right-wing militias and white supremacists have made it a point to try to be recruited into the military and to enter law enforcement.
Answer the question, Mr. Green.
I am answering the question. It's not thought police to make sure that our police don't subscribe to white supremacist ideals. It's not thought police to make sure that our politicians don't subscribe to conspiracy theories and want to overthrow the government. I draw a distinct line between the two.
Mr. Greenblatt, can people not have differing opinions and those opinions not affect the actual work that they do? We all raised our hand to the same oath of office. Do you not agree with that? That they can have differing opinions and it does not affect the job that they do?
I deeply agree in the value of differing opinions and fierce debate. But fierce debate shouldn't. But fierce debate shouldn't. Fierce debate shouldn't allow you to dehumanize me or any other person from any minority group.
I didn't say that. Okay, thank you. And also, I'd also like to comment that I completely disagree with the putting the National Guard under the mayor of D.C. The mayor of D.C. is not a governor, and as a reservist, I think it's very important that that separation continue to exist. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Georgia yields back the time. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Luria, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us to talk about an important topic today. As a new member interested in this Congress and also joining the Homeland Security Committee, because I know that this is really a threat to our country and our democracy. And I think these are important issues that we need to continue to address. I'd like to address my question to Mr. Greenblatt and follow up on what one of my colleagues just mentioned a few minutes ago. As he mentioned, we've seen the photos of insurrectionists in the Capitol who are wearing sweatshirts that say Camp Auschwitz, 6 MWE, 6 million wasn't enough, which is just reprehensible to myself as a Jewish American, but I would assume to everyone who is watching and listening to this today. I would like to just spend a little bit of time addressing in a little bit more depth some of the anti-Semitic tropes that appear frequently in these white nationalist groups and are associated with movements such as QAnon, and how we could potentially look to address these issues and what you as an organization are doing to identify these groups and threats and root out some of these tropes that have existed for a long time, that are just very clearly manifesting themselves today in the public eye.
Well, thank you very much for the question, Ms. Congresswoman. I would say a few thoughts. So number one, again, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory of sorts and at the core of white supremacy in this country. So it didn't just start on January the 6th. We saw this from Capitol Hill to Charlottesville. And before that, you've seen it again and again. Ms. Newman referenced the Turner Diaries. If you go back and look at white supremacist literature and philosophy, again, it is rooted in a hatred of the Jewish people. And again, it's not right or left, it's just right and wrong. And there should be no excuse for it in any public setting. In terms of what to do about it, there are a few things. Number one, I do believe, and I believe this very fiercely, that we've got to hold these white supremacists and right-wing extremists accountable for their actions. Every individual who perpetrated in that attack should be identified and arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. And we need to make sure that hate crimes are tracked effectively at the local level and their perpetrators punished, again, to the fullest extent of the law. So there's some degree of deterrence. But I also think we can't just legislate or arrest our way out of this situation. We've also got to change hearts and minds. I really applaud Congresswoman Maloney for the Never Again Education Act that was passed in the last session that mandates Holocaust and genocide education. We are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history if we don't learn from them. And so educating young people about the Holocaust and hate, all forms of hate, can have a demonstrable impact. At the ADL, we're one of the largest providers in the United States of anti-hate content in schools. We reach over 1.5 million kids a year, and we do that because we have seen the difference it makes when children learn about difference. They demonstrate more compassion, more empathy, and it can affect conditioning the environment to be more tolerant of everyone, no matter how you pray or where you're from or who you love.
Well, thank you for that additional insight and feedback, and appreciate the work that you continue to do on behalf of this important topic. And I yield back for the time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes, Mr. Pfluger.
Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, thank you for this opportunity. I'm grateful to serve on this committee. And really, there's no greater importance to our country than for us and those in our military and law enforcement to safeguard the American people from any threats. As a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Air Force myself, and somebody who has fought all over the world, and most recently against terrorism in the Middle East, I hope that I can bring some value in that same commitment to our work here. As you may know, the 11th District of Texas, which I represent, is a critical intersection of national security interest for our country. It lays just north of the southern border, over 1,200 miles of shared border between Texas and Mexico, and is home to the top producing area for oil and gas, a tremendous amount, millions of acres, in fact, of agriculture, of farm and ranch land, and of a military base, which trains intelligence personnel for our joint defense. It's a pretty incredible place that produces food, fuel, fiber, empowers and feeds the American people. A country that feeds and fuels itself is inherently safer and more secure. And ensuring that the development and the transportation of these resources remain safe and secure from chemical, biological, cyber, terrorism, or any other threats is of utmost importance. So I appreciate the work that's being done here. I'm additionally thankful for the trust bestowed upon me to use my experiences to lead my Republican colleagues on the Subcommittee for Intelligence and Counterterrorism. I'd like to congratulate Chairwoman Slotkin as the chair for that subcommittee, and I look forward to working with her to continue to strengthen the intelligence community and deter those future threats. I look forward to working together with all of the committee on something that really is a nonpartisan issue, the security of our country. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to specifically thank you for your thoughts earlier on making sure that we don't distract from the threat, that there is no attempt to distract from the threat. And right now our country is facing a number of threats, and homeland security is incredibly important. I'd like to explore a topic, and I'll start with Mr. Greenblatt on the subject of rhetoric, and specifically that rhetoric which could embolden. And I'd like to kind of pull this thread a little bit, Mr. Greenblatt, and ask your opinion on the escalation of rhetoric that has happened. And I'll use a partisan term that's happened on both sides, or the lack of rhetoric or the lack of ability to condemn violence or selective condemnation, and just hear your thoughts on where we are today and how that rhetoric has shaped this point. So, Mr. Greenblatt, over to you.
Sorry, Congressman Pfluger, thank you for the question. I think it's absolutely fair to say that neither side of the political spectrum is exempt from intolerance. And as I said in my opening remarks, we have seen extremism on both sides. It's absolutely true. And I think it comes upon everyone, regardless of how you vote, to represent a core set of values like decency and fairness and the humanity of their fellow man and women. That being said, I don't want to engage in kind of a whataboutism here. Like what happened on January the 6th really has no precedent. I mean, again, at ADL, we track these extremists. And I just want to clarify, what we saw that day wasn't a riot, it was an attack, right? Those weren't like protesters, they were militants who were marching up the Capitol steps to kidnap and murder many of you if they had the chance. And those people who would try to undermine our democracy and kidnap and kill our elected officials, I just think we've got to acknowledge the fact that they were coming from one particular hateful ideology. And let me just say this, I don't think white supremacy has anything to do with traditional Republican politics. We do ourselves and we do our great democratic tradition a deep injustice when we pretend as if these people are on the spectrum. They're not, they're way off the spectrum. They belong in the dustbin of history.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. Ms. Newman, thank you, and to all the witnesses for your expertise today. Very interested in your thoughts on how a commission and how a nonpartisan look at this issue can be executed, and recommendations for how we can conduct this and the types of resources that we pull in to make sure that we hear the facts, that we make good decisions, and that we come up with a good solution. For Ms. Newman.
Gentleman's time has expired, but I'll allow Ms. Newman to answer the question.
I would suggest that the model that we saw out of the 9/11 Commission worked fairly well. I am sure that some of the staff and commissioners probably have some lessons learned about how they could improve on that model, and I think that's something that is worth the committee's consideration. It certainly needs to be bipartisan. It certainly needs to be staffed in a full-time basis. They certainly need to have the authority to be able to review documents and compel people to tell the truth. And then you need a wide variety of expertise, and you also need to ensure that various perspectives that have concerns, legitimate concerns, feel heard, and that there is buy-in into the process. And what I specifically mean is that already in the last few weeks, we have seen voices from the Muslim community, from the Black community, expressed concern that if we change the law, it ultimately will boomerang back around, even though we're saying it's because of white supremacists, it's going to boomerang back around and affect their communities. This is coming from very real experiences that these communities have faced in the previous decades. That needs to be heard. We need to learn from our mistakes of the last 20 years in particular, and build that into whatever recommendations come out. But I also would argue that we've seen too many deaths. We've seen the most catastrophic, symbolic and physical attack from a domestic terrorist since 1995. Not doing things, not updating our laws that in some cases haven't been touched in 50 years is also not the answer. So I would encourage that we hear from the voices that have concerns, treat that with seriousness, but also not to let that become so chilling that we can't find a path forward.
Gentleman from
Chairman,
Texas,
thank you so
time.
much for allowing that.
Thank you. Chair, gentleman from Texas, time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey for 5 minutes, Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I am so happy to have a chance to join the committee this year and look forward to working with you and all of my colleagues. Mr. Greenblatt, I wanted to start by taking you back to something you said about the people who were part of that mob that attacked the Capitol on January 6th. And you said, I think quite rightly, that under normal circumstances, we would have recognized them as just ordinary Americans who were absolutely convinced in that moment that what they were doing, this deviant thing that they were doing, was something completely normal. And they were also probably convinced that most Americans were completely on their side, agreed with them. And you mentioned that one reason for this, and this is, I think, the core problem we face, is that they were radicalized to these beliefs on social media. They came to believe that what they were doing was normal and everyone supported them. And my first question to you is, how did that happen? Did they just wake up one morning, these school teachers and real estate agents and fitness instructors, and decide they were going to search on the internet for neo-Nazi beliefs or white supremacy, or did something recommend it to them?
So, Congressman, oops, am I mute? No, I'm not mute. Congressman Malinowski, thank you for your question. And again, as someone who I know throughout your career, you've looked at human rights issues around the world. I think what you probably saw happen on January the 6th bore resemblance to coups and other insurrections you've seen in developing countries across the planet.
It did, yes.
So I want to say one thing that builds upon my earlier answer. We need to recognize that the reason why tens of millions of ordinary Americans came to the National Mall is because, first, I will just say they were rallied to do so by mainstream politicians. They were encouraged to show up by mainstream pundits on cable news shows. So we do need to acknowledge that there is a broad responsibility for what happened. And again, the politicians who were standing there on the mall, encouraging them with it, waving their fists to go take Congress, they were only from one. I mean, it's not a political statement, it's an observation of fact. They were only from one party. So let's say that, number one. Number two, indeed, why do people believe this kind of insanity and this lunacy that there are pedophilia, Satan worshiping Democrats, in the basements of police parlors, eating children, for God's sakes? In part, it is because the algorithms that animate these social media platforms invisibly to the user route information to them. So once you click on a certain kind of story, it is often reinforced. And any of us can see this today if we have a normal internet browser like Chrome or Firefox or whatnot, or Edge, and you look at a YouTube video, it will start to send you more videos, the kinds of which you just looked at. And so that algorithmic routing that happens to the user unknown shapes their worldview and creates what Eli Pariser calls filter bubbles. And they're deeply dangerous when they are telling people that, again, you have this conspiracy trying to hurt them.
So just one example of that, Facebook in 2018, they did an internal study in which they determined that 64% of all people joining an extremist group on their platform was due to their recommendation tools, that it was recommended to them to do that by Facebook. And the reason for that is that these algorithms are engagement based, right? In other words, they are designed to maximize the time that everybody spends glued to the screen, and they figured out that what does that to us is content that reinforces our most passionate, intense beliefs, our fears and our hates. Isn't that correct?
It is absolutely correct. And their business models are based on engagement and clicks. And as they used to say for local news, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And so again, if it's a conspiracy, it drives clicks. And it is deep. We see that these things don't happen in a vacuum. Online hate and conspiracy theories can metastasize into real world violence. We saw that on January the 6th.
And so you'd mentioned the legislation that I introduced with Congresswoman Chu, which is a narrow effort to deny these companies immunity under Section 230 if that kind of content, which they promote through these algorithms, contributes to real world violence. And I would say to all my colleagues, we can believe that the biggest problem is on the right, on the far right, or on the far left. It doesn't matter. We can debate that. But whichever of those things you believe, you should be for this, because the mechanism works the same way. It pushes people on the left, further left. It pushes people on the right, further right, until they reach an extreme that, as you rightly said, is totally out of the mainstream. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I assure the gentleman from New Jersey that issue has come up in a number of questions and responses to those questions. And at some point, that part of the jurisdictional edge that we have, we'll look at it. And we'll talk to the other committees, obviously, because it presents a clear and present danger to us all if we don't get our arms around it.
Thank you, Mr.
Chair. Thank you. Chair recognizes gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Meyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Thompson, and Ranking Member Katko, and our esteemed guests for joining us here today. I'm Peter Meyer, representing Michigan's 3rd Congressional District, and proud to also be the ranking member on the Subcommittee of Oversight, Management, and Accountability. I'm extremely excited to be sitting on this committee. I'm excited for the opportunity to work in a bipartisan fashion to address the security concerns that are confronting our nation, especially those of a domestic nature. I've been greatly enjoying and learning a lot from the conversations so far. Ms. Newman, I really appreciate you offering that clarification. The way in which we are engaging the delta between how we treat international terrorism and sort of the statutory grounding to prosecute versus domestic, I think is a really salient issue. As you noted, the arrest in September of 2 Boogaloo boys, for conspiring with Hamas, and the way that the FBI, especially in undercover operations, has to, in most cases, default to finding an international connection in order to move forward on a prosecution, does suggest that we need to be reevaluating, or as Mr. Jenkins said, fundamentally rethink some of these dynamics. And that's a point I want to get back to in a minute. But one thing that was in Mr. Greenblatt's written remarks, I think I really want to drill down in a little bit, and it's around the concept of accelerationism. It's originally came from Marx. It was a claim that capitalism carries the seeds of its own destruction with the inherent social conflicts it creates. But what started off as a sort of more left-wing notion has kind of crossed over, and maybe it's with a horseshoe theory where extremists on both sides loop back in the middle, and found its root on the right as well. The Boogaloo boys are arguably accelerationists. One of the uniting threads between some of the people who stormed the Capitol, such as the QAnon shaman with the face paint and the Viking horns, is just this desire to bring about some type of cataclysm, some means of upsetting the order. And the question is, why is that so persuasive? Why are so many folks feeling disaffected and become entranced by some of these wilder theories? I think, Ms. Newman, you said in your testimony, It's about filling unmet needs caused by marginalization, grievance, and humiliation. And indeed, a lot of the folks I spoke to who felt compelled and came out on the 6th, not necessarily those who were violent, didn't speak to any of them, but those who they did feel a sense of humiliation. They felt a sense of grievance and a means of address. And obviously, please do not take this to be a whataboutism or a both sidesism. I voted for impeachment and was one of only 10 Republicans to do so, and have unequivocally condemned the actions of January 6th, and look forward to, on this hearing, making sure we are doing the necessary steps for redress. But I want to circle back and ask the question of Mr. Jenkins. When you talk about fundamentally rethinking our approach, as Ms. Newman said, with the challenge between how we treat international terrorism and how we treat domestic, it also seems that the broader issue is it's easier to go after an organization, something with a hierarchy, a command and control structure, and that is identifiable in a way. But when it's in a more persuasive ideology like accelerationism, how do we then root out that cause at the individual level, and rather than having a strictly reactive approach? So, Mr. Jenkins, I would appreciate your thoughts along those lines.
Thank you very much for the question. Look, some recent research, not done by RAND, but done by the University of Chicago, looking at the people who were arrested for participation in the events on January 6th, based upon statements they made on their own Facebook accounts and so on, indicates that about 20% of them were actually members of extremist groups going in, that the remaining 80% were there because they felt the election had been stolen. Now, that raises a broader issue, and that is we don't want to see the radicalization of the 80% by that 20%. And part of the strategy, counterterrorism strategy, has to be that we will isolate the violent extremists from a potential constituency. That means going after with the full force of the law after the violent extremists. But it also means addressing some of the issues that are broader. Now, I'm not for one moment suggesting any kind of co-option or compromise with individuals in groups whose causes are fundamentally antithetical to unalienable rights that we accept. But I am saying that within that broader community, there are individuals who feel marginalized, people who have lost faith in our political systems. This is on both sides of the political spectrum. And what we have to do in our zeal to go after the violent component is not accidentally brand as enemies of the state a broader section of our population. Now, that is a continuing strategy, and that's one of the reasons actually why I want so much of our efforts against the violent extremists to be done within the ordinary criminal code. Put aside the political pretensions. Don't give them that. These are crimes: murder, assault, willful destruction of property. Deal with it on that basis.
Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California for 5 minutes, Mr. Swalwell. Unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chairman. Also, thank the ranking member, for the collaboration on taking on such an important issue. And I think for this to be our first hearing in the new Congress reflects the true threat that we are facing from domestic terrorism, particularly from white supremacy groups. Last year, researchers at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point Academy, they monitored QAnon activity on Telegram, and they found that there is a growing overlap between QAnon channels and more extremist channels affiliated with Proud Boys, paramilitary groups, and white supremacists. Have any of you similarly observed an overlap between QAnon adherents, white supremacists, militias, and other potentially violent extremists. And Ms. Newman, I think we should start with you, just considering your expertise and service in government.
Thanks for the question. Yes, I mean, look, this idea of ideology is we started to recognize maybe 3 or 4 years ago that it's kind of held loosely. There's a phenomenon called ideology hopping. When I was serving in the government, we had U.S. attorneys telling us anecdotes of individuals that would join one white supremacist group, then get frustrated it wasn't violent enough, and then left and joined a ISIS-related group, which you would think is contradictory, but for some, it's just about the other psychological unmet needs that are driving them towards the violence, and not about the ideology itself. And so increasingly, you're seeing intermixing of groups, and QAnon, kind of made it famous to build your own conspiracy. So the thing that you might think QAnon is 5 days ago has changed at this point. We certainly see that as it pertains to, there was this expectation that on January 20th was going to be the big moment and everybody was going to get rounded up and executed in one big day of judgment, and Trump was still going to be president. And when it didn't happen, some recognized, oh, I've been conned, moved on, but a whole bunch just came up with the next theory. Now it's January 31st. Now it's March 4th. They just keep evolving the theory. And so the more that some of these conversations go mainstream, the more that you see intermingling between the groups. The fact that they were in person together on January 6th was this massive networking opportunity. And as Mr. Jenkins pointed out, we've got to drive a wedge between these two. We don't want the organized organizations to be able to recruit from the unaffiliated, because that unaffiliated population is very large. So all of those factors have made the job of law enforcement and counterterrorism professionals more difficult, because we're so used to thinking about a neat ideology, and in fact, what's driving the individuals may change from day to day, which is why the prevention efforts that we started a few years ago that were based off of this RAND study that they ran in 2018 actually are ideologically neutral, that the signs and indicators of somebody mobilizing to violence, the risk factors, the stress factors, they're largely ideologically neutral, which allows us to train bystanders and develop capabilities, locally driven capabilities that might be able to intervene with an individual before they mobilize to violence.
Ms. Newman, what effect does it have on a group like QAnon or a white supremacy group when people who they perceive are leaders in government and people they would support denounce them? Like, does that have an effect when they are denounced by people who they are supporting? Like, and how important is it to do that as far as legitimizing or delegitimizing them?
Historically, your anti-government extremist and white supremacist groups are used to being antithetical to the government, meaning they view the government as the enemy. So they're used to the condemnation. What shifted was that all of a sudden, people in authority, people in with elected officials, and then, quite frankly, some of the media outlets started using some of their ideology to justify their positions. That mainstreaming effect emboldened them. And then when given the opportunity to condemn, and certain personalities have not, that further emboldens them, and it makes them feel like they can be more brash and bold in both what they say and in what they do. So to counteract it, yes, it'd be great if we could go back to the way things were, and the condemnation helps prevent enlarging the problem, but it doesn't necessarily get rid of the problem.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbino, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for hosting this hearing today. Securing the homeland from all threats is the most critical thing that we can do in America. I'm honored and eager to fill the seat on this committee left by my predecessor, Congressman Pete King. And I look forward to continuing to protect New York and our nation from all security risks. Nearly 500 Long Islanders were killed in the horrific events on September 11th, and many more Long Islanders have died or become sick in the years following that fateful day. I'm committed to continuing to fight against radical Islamic terrorism, as well as the increasing threat of additional foreign and domestic terrorism. As a New Yorker who is tough on terrorism and strongly supportive of law enforcement, I'm eager to get to work as the ranking member of the Cybersecurity, Infrastructure Protection, and Innovation Subcommittee. And I look forward to working with my fellow New Yorker, Congresswoman Clark, on these important issues. I'm also excited to be a member of the Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Recovery Subcommittee. My district was ravaged by Superstorm Sandy, and dealing with these issues is very important to me and my constituents. As all Americans continue to adapt to working and learning remotely as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, I believe it's now more important than ever to work with agencies like CISA to fight to protect our data, infrastructure, and networks. Although it remains true that malicious cyber attacks are an increasingly tactic used by America's adversaries to degrade our operational capabilities, we cannot ignore the fact that physical attacks by extremists in our nation exist today. Physical threats and attacks by extremist groups are one of the greatest risks to our democracy, as evidenced by the events that occurred against the United States Capitol on January 6th. We must not let these criminals win. We must rise above partisan labels and rhetoric and denounce all forms of violent extremism. That is why my colleagues and I are co-sponsoring H.R. 275 to establish a National Commission on the Domestic Terrorist Act upon the United States Capitol. We must condemn the actions of those who stormed the Capitol and urge law enforcement to prosecute these criminals to the fullest extent of the law. The establishment of a commission will provide a bipartisan venue to ensure that what happened on January 6th never happens again in our country. Just as the September 11th Commission has been cited as one of the most widely accepted data sources on 9/11, I strongly believe that our National Commission to analyze these events on January 6th will provide factual data and solutions that will help heal our wounds and begin to pave the way to recovery across the United States. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was noted earlier that the security failure on January 6th was not an intelligence failure, but it was a planning failure. And for me, the lack of preparedness on the part of the federal government for the siege on the US Capitol reflects a deeper problem. It reflects a pattern of almost willful blindness to white supremacist violence as a domestic terror threat. Even though white supremacist violence has been the dominant driver of domestic terrorism in the United States for decades, the federal government did not designate a white supremacist group as a terrorist organization until 2020. What does that tell us about the seriousness or lack thereof with which the federal government treats white supremacist extremism as a domestic terror threat? And that question is for Ms. Newman.
Thank you for that question. So interestingly enough, what the designation that you're referencing used the foreign terrorist designation statute. That means that we cannot use it. The restrictions that are in there do not allow us to designate a group that originated in the United States. Sadly, most of what we consider global white supremacism at this point is originating from the United States. Now, there are other active pockets, particularly in Germany, some of the Nordic countries, Russia, Australia recognizes that they have some challenges, but in large part, when you talk in the counterterrorism community, and this happened in 2018, I was at a conference with 100 other like-minded nations that was supposed to be talking about returning foreign terrorist fighters coming out of Syria. And everybody was acknowledging that the growing rise of what the world calls right-wing violent extremism was a problem, and they were turning to us and saying, you guys are the exporters, what are you going to do about it? The laws are not written to address the global nature of the threat that we are facing, and many of these laws have been around for decades. It's time for them to be updated, in my opinion.
Fair enough, but I think it's important to emphasize that the United States does not have a monopoly on white supremacist extremism. It's a global phenomenon. And I find it odd that the United States until 2020 did not designate any white supremacist group anywhere in the world as a terrorist organization. For me, it just speaks volumes about the counterterrorism priorities of the federal government. I have a question about social media sites. We all know that social media sites have been amplifiers of disinformation. And we know that social media sites have been enabler of coordination among white supremacist extremists who might otherwise operate as lone wolves, but who can organize more easily online. Social media companies have been part of the problem. My question is, how do we get those companies to be part of the solution? How do we get those companies to do their part in countering terrorism?
Who is that question directed to, Mr.?
It could be anyone, but I think this was Greenblatt actually brought up social media companies earlier, so I was directed to you.
Sure. So first of all, I would say your earlier point about the global threat of white supremacy is real. There were European white supremacists marching in Charlottesville. There have been American white supremacists who've participated in marches and training exercises in Europe. We saw what happened in Christchurch that harkened back to what happened in Charleston. You are absolutely right. It is a global terror threat and needs to be treated as such. With respect to social media companies, look, ADL literally opened a center in Silicon Valley in 2017. I have staffed that not with nonprofit veterans, but rather with industry veterans from the technology space, because we need to have engineers on our side working to address these issues. We can't wait for the companies to do so. But I will be honest, Mr. Congressman, their lackadaisical approach to this, their laziness, feeling like they're shielded from liability by Section 230, therefore they can be hands off, that needs to change. We saw what happened in the wake of the Capitol Hill attack. We saw how they could immediately move when push came to shove to remove armed militia groups, to remove white supremacists, to shut down those accounts that were spouting disinformation, delegitimizing the election, and literally inciting violence. They've had the capabilities, but in order to align interests, I would encourage you, number one, to look very hard at how do we reduce the liability shield to clarify what they're responsible for. Number two, I think you've got to look at the issue of monopolistic indifference and whether platforms like Facebook are just so big, just so large, that they're immune and invulnerable to the typical competitive pressures and fiduciary pressures that most companies deal with. So I think both from the 230 end and even the antitrust end, there's work for Congress to do to apply the appropriate oversight to make sure these companies, which again are so innovative and have done so much good in so many levels, are not undermining our democracy and spreading stereotypes and hate.
Time has expired, but let me just take off from that as chair. It's obvious that 230, we'll look at, I'll repeat it. If the companies don't assume the interest in policing their own platforms, then you leave government no choice. So for those companies who might be listening to this hearing, it's absolutely essential that they step up in a big way, because obviously from the question and the responses, there's interest on the right and left, Democrat and Republican, that we have to look at it. And I assure you as chair, we will. I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the following reports. The Southern Poverty Law Center's report entitled A Year in Hate and Extremism 2020, and Everytown's report entitled The Role of Guns and Armed Extremism in the Attack on the U.S. Capitol. I'd also like to indicate that there's an FBI report on extremist activities in the United States that's 7 months overdue. I don't know what we'll have to do to get the FBI to produce that information on extremist activities in the U.S. But it would be advantageous to the committee and the public at large if that report was made available. And I assure you, we will push the necessary buttons again to ask for that report as mandated by Congress. Additionally, I ask unanimous consent to submit a letter from the Leadership Conference and signed by 135 civil rights organizations, as well as a letter from the Center for Democracy and Technology and signed by 24 additional civil rights organizations for the record. Without objection, the committee record shall be kept open for 10 days. Hearing no further business, the committee stands adjourned.